Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to the Thought Adventure podcast. And today we have a special episode. This is episode number 5 here on the podcast. Today we're going to be discussing if consciousness is a miracle. Now, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but the main thrust of what we're going to be talking about is whether or not consciousness can be grounded on materialism. And so we're going to intro the topic, give our thoughts on answering that question, and then we will eventually make it to the audience to where you guys can call in and give us your thoughts and comments on it. We especially would like to hear from atheists or materialists because we want to hear what you guys have to say about this. He's mainly going to be addressing the naturalists here in the audience. But I do want to point out that we've got a special guest on our panel today, his brother Hamza. He's nice enough to bless us with his presence and join us. He's got a little bit of an expertise on the matter because he's done his master's on consciousness. So we do want to hear his thoughts. And Brother Hamza, if you want to start off by just addressing the audience, maybe most people here, I'm sure, already know who you are. But if you want to just explain a little bit of your background in the field, because you've done a master's on it, and then answer the question as to whether or not you think consciousness can actually be grounded on materialism or not.
Okay, good. Thanks for the introduction, Jake. May Allah bless you all. Jazakallah for the opportunity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, my name is Hamza, and I wrote a book called The Divine Reality, and I did an MA in philosophy. My dissertation was on the hard problem of consciousness and other bits and pieces. And I'm continuing my postgraduate research at the University of London. And I have a particular interest in consciousness because I had a bit of an issue when I was around, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 years old. I had this kind of existential crisis, not from the point of view of meaning or the point of view of, purpose in life. It was more a form of solipsism, which was, I had a realization, it just dawned on me that I was the only one aware of my own conscious awareness, and I wasn't aware of other people's conscious awareness at the same time that I'm aware of my own awareness. Now, that might be confusing. That might be a bit confusing, but that was extremely lonely. It just dawned on me. It was such a lonely thing that I think I started crying. I'll get slightly, contextually depressed because I felt like I was maybe the only one who really exists, right? Now, people may not empathize with this at all because they haven't had this experience. Alhamdulillah, thank God. But some people just have those experiences. And I think that was a kind of emotional, existential driver in order for me to try and explore the whole topic of consciousness a little bit more. And that's why I was very fascinated with the hard problem of consciousness. Now, as many of you may know or not know, the hard problem of consciousness in the philosophy of the mind is really based on two key questions. People think it's only one question, but in actual fact, it's two key questions. The first key question is, what is it like for a particular organism to have an inner subjective conscious experience? Okay. So I know I have inner subjective conscious experiences. And I know what it's like for me to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday looking at the sunset. But what about Jake's inner subjective conscious experience? Can I know what it's like for Jake to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday looking at the sunset? No, I just have my own. Now, it's subjectivity for sure. However, it is a first person fact. No one can deny the fact that they have an awareness of their own awareness, or they are undergoing or they're experiencing a form of phenomenal consciousness, because in the literature it's also called known as phenomenality or phenomenal experience, which basically means inner subjective conscious experience. So I may be able to describe my experience as warm, sweet, beautiful, and you may use exactly the same words, and we're thinking we're talking about the same type of inner subjective conscious experience, but in actual fact we still wouldn't know. Why? Because words are vehicles to meaning, and meaning is like a reflection, a mirror of that inner subjective conscious experience. So when I say warm and beautiful and amazing, I have a certain kind of experience that backs that up. That's personal to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jake has exactly the same type of experience, even though he's using the same words.
Right.
So this is what you may call the epistemic gap. There's an epistemological gap, meaning there is a gap of knowledge. How do we bridge that gap under materialism? And by the way, when we use the word materialism in the philosophy of the mind, it's used synonymously with physicalism. Yes, they have two different histories. However, they really mean the following, that consciousness can be reduced to or is identical to physical processes. Materialism historically used to talk about bits of matter, but in the philosophy of the mind, in the literature, as far as I'm aware of it, that those two terms are used synonymously, and they're used in the context that we've just said, that all consciousness can be reduced to in some way or identical to physical processes. So that's the first question of the hard problem. The second question is not an epistemological question. It's not an epistemic question, because a lot of the naturalists, they say, oh, we're going to bridge the gap, right? We're going to bridge that gap. When we know the science, when we learn more science, we'll bridge it, which I think is a huge fallacious argument we could discuss later and unpack it later. But the point here is, they say we could bridge that gap, but they've misunderstood the hard problem, because the hard problem is not just an epistemic issue, it's an ontological issue, meaning the source and nature of reality. So the second question is, why and how do phenomenal experiences, meaning how and why do inner subjective conscious experiences arise from neurobiological processes? This has some epistemic issues, but it's also an ontological issue, given the fact that we have a kind of first-person fact sensation of what it's like to have inner subjective conscious experiences, and we know what kind of physical processes are supposed to be, because even according to the naturalists, physical processes are what? They're blind and non-conscious. What does that mean? Let's unpack that. When we say physical processes are blind, it means there is no intentional force directing them anywhere. When we say they're non-conscious, we're saying physical processes do not have something called intentionality. I know that's a massive issue in the philosophy of the mind. There's lots of ikhtilaf, as they say, differences of opinion. But just to break it down in a simple way, intentionality is about aboutness. Yeah. For example, I'm looking at my mobile phone. My stream of consciousness now is about something other than what's in here. It's outside. It's about something else. Physical processes, by definition, are not about anything. They're not even about themselves. They just are cold and non-conscious from that perspective. So one would argue, if that's the ontology of physicalism, which also relates to philosophical naturalism, then how can we have inner subjective conscious experiences arise from seemingly cold and non-conscious physical processes? It's like, whoa, right? So how do they try and answer these questions? So let me go backwards. The first way they try to answer this question, especially from the kind of atheistic perspective, is science, neuroscience, neurobiological studies is going to solve the problem. Now, with all due respect, right? With all due respect, neuroscience is predicated on a philosophical assumption. This is well known. If you read the works of Rex Wilson, Antti Revoncio, Manzotti, Moderato, blah, 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 the philosophers of the mind and even neuroscientists themselves understand that neurobiological studies, neuroscience, it assumes physicalism. So all neurobiological studies can do is basically give you a physicalistic approach or a materialistic approach to this question. And by definition, it won't really solve the problem, because it will be always assuming physicalism to be true. What we're trying to show now is, well, is physicalism true? Is materialism or physicalism the correct philosophy of the mind to understand the reality of consciousness, right? They can't even start dealing with that question, because all neurobiological studies are basically predicated on this philosophical assumption, which is physicalism. So neuroscience will never be able to address this issue, because neuroscience, generally speaking, is a study of correlations. As one of my friends who did a master's in neuroscience, he called it pixelated phrenology. Yeah, the phrenology is the study of the brain. It's pixelated phrenology, and And listen to this. This is my challenge. Even if we're to map out the entirety of Jake's brain, right? Say we map it out and we can correlate every single pattern and the minutiae, the differences, and correlate them to inner subjective conscious experiences and correlate those to his utterances of the descriptions of his inner experiences, it still won't solve the problem. It will still won't answer both questions. He won't answer, okay, well, what is it like for Jake to undergo a particular inner subjective conscious experience? We just have his descriptions, right?
Right.
But what is it like? And we won't be able to answer the question, well, how on earth does he have this inner subjective conscious experience arising from seemingly cold, blind physical processes? So even if neuroscience were to map everything in the brain, because this is one of the arguments from the atheist. Look, man, when we know everything about the brain, we'll know everything about consciousness. Whoa. That would only make sense if you're an eliminative materialist, right? But we could discuss that a bit later. So neuroscience can't really deal with the problem. And I've got something here from Professor, I forgot his name now. He's from King's College University in London. He actually articulated a really powerful undercutting defeater to people who claim that neuroscience is actually, if we know more about the brain, we'll know more about consciousness from the point of view of inner subjective conscious experiences. So he makes a really beautiful point here. It's Papineau, the Professor Papineau. I think his name is David Papineau. He presents a really nice argument. I want to summarize the argument for you. It's just 7 statements. So he says, number 1, and I'm paraphrasing, a neurochemical event E is identical with the conscious experience P. Number 2, E cannot be absent when P is testified to be present. 3, E cannot be present when P is testified to be absent. 4, E must be present to be necessary for P. 5, E is sometimes absent when P is testified to be present. 6, E is sometimes present when P is testified to be absent. 7, conclusion, therefore E is not necessary for P. So his conclusion is that the neurochemical event E is not necessary for inner subjective conscious experience P. Because when you do a study of all the neurobiological correlations, you will see that sometimes the neurobiological event E is not always present for a particular P. And sometimes it's absent, sometimes it's present, and so on and so forth. So it shows that the correlations they have found so far are not necessary for P, which is a really interesting argument by Papineau. Now, I've gone too long. I don't want to take too much time. So I just want to mention what are the physicalist claims. So I'm not going to go into them and refute them. I think we should do that together.
Right.
So one approach is what you would call eliminative materialism, okay? And one would argue that the Churchlands had this view, Dennett had this view in 1991. He wrote the book Consciousness Explained. Some philosophers said that book should have been called Consciousness Explained Away, because he doesn't deal with the questions of the hard problem of consciousness. He just thinks that we're just like, robots. We don't have any consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So it's eliminative materialism, which basically says that there is no consciousness. That's essentially what they're saying. And we could unpack what it means and unpack and how we can address that during the podcast today. And by the way, a lot of the empirical neurobiological studies that have fancy names, right? There are so many fancy names for many different, the neuro correlations and all of that fancy names, right? All of these things still have these approaches as their philosophical assumptions. So it's very important to deal with the philosophical assumptions, because the kind of minutiae of the empirical neurobiological study is interesting, but it's really predicated on these approaches anyway. So one is eliminative materialism. The other one is reductive materialism, which basically says it doesn't deny inner subjective conscious experience, but it says that the brain, or our understanding of science or understanding of the brain, would eventually close the gap, and we'll be able to understand that consciousness can be explained or reduced to physical processes in some way. So they don't say individual process or individual bits of matter. They will say, you can reduce it to physical processes in some way. Then we could discuss why that fails.
Right.
The other physicalist approach, which is very popular, is called functionalism. Functionalism, just to really make you understand this, is like a mirroring a computer system. You have inputs, mental states, and outputs. And they say when you have an input, for example, your bus is coming, right? And your mental state is, oh my God, I'm going to be late, right? You have the inner subjective conscious experience, so I'm actually late. And then the output is that you start running for your bus. So there is a connection between inputs, outputs, and mental states. But as you know, that doesn't even answer any of the problems of the hard problems of consciousness. But we could address that later. Another view, well, probably the final physicalist view, main physicalist view, is what you call emergent materialism, which is getting quite popular. And there are two forms of emergent materialism. You have strong emergent materialism and weak emergent materialism. Strong emergent materialism says, look, consciousness exists, but it's based on complex physical processes, and these physical processes have complex causal relations, and it's impossible to unravel them. And they said to try and understand it, it's equivalent of putting, for example, Darwin's book on the origin of species in a hamster's cage, thinking the hamster's going to understand its origins, right? It's an interesting point, but it's a failed point, because all they're doing, they're really assuming some type of physicalism like reductive materialism anyway, or reductive materialism. And it's a bit of a cop-out, and we could discuss later why that's the case. The other version, which is called weak emergent materialism, which basically says, yes, it's based on complex physical processes, and these physical processes have complex causal relations. When we unravel them, we will be able to understand subjective consciousness. But really, that's not a philosophy in itself. That's reductive materialism. You're assuming reductive materialism to be true. And if you've dealt with reductive materialism, then you've dealt with weak emergence. And they give you things like, what about water? You have the molecules of oxygen and hydrogen, and they combine together to give you properties that don't exist in the original individual processes. That's what emergent materialism basically says, that you're going to get something, an emergent property like consciousness, and the properties of consciousness cannot be found in the individual processes or in the physical system that is causally related and causally connected. And they say, look, this exists in science anyway. Look at water, H2O. You have hydrogen, you have oxygen, and you put them together and they causally relate in some way, and you have properties of water that don't belong to the individual molecules, for example, the individual atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, right? So you have water that is shiny and it's a transparent liquid, but those properties cannot be found in the individual processes themselves, which we know that example is a really bad example for many reasons, which we could discuss. So those are the main type of physicalist ontologies, if you like, or the physicalist approaches to the mind. And I would argue from this, we could even talk about God's existence from the hard problem of consciousness, but that's maybe for another day. Sorry for waffling, but that's the introduction.
No, that was great.
No. It was a great introduction. Really do appreciate it. So as far as what I understood you saying, Brother Hamza, is that there's two main problems with consciousness and materialism. One is an ontological problem, and one is an epistemological problem. And then you went over various different possible responses that are offered in the literature in philosophy of mind from a materialist or physicalist paradigm. And then you explain some of the issues or potential issues with each one of those responses to the two problems that you mentioned. So I think that was a great intro to explaining sort of the foundations for the discussion. I do want to point out to the audience that we are going to spend a little bit more time on the introduction portion of this, because it is a bit more in depth and kind of gets in the weeds a little bit philosophically. So we want to lay the groundwork for the discussion before we invite guests on. And we're probably going to shoot for maybe around 45 minutes to an hour to when we start to invite guests on. But yeah, once again, Hamza, I do appreciate that intro. Now, Brother Sharif, I want to hear what your thoughts are on the question: can materialism actually account for or ground consciousness? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think Brother Hamza's mentioned a lot of points and really covered the subject area comprehensively, it seems, on this. How I also see it is when we look at the issue of consciousness, what we're asking is, how is it that non-physical things become self-aware, have this internal experience? How do physical, non-conscious things have this internal experience? That's the first question we're trying to work out. The second question is, okay, how do we approach that? How can we analyze the internal experiences of something that's physical? What do we do? So normally the scientists will say, well, we'll use science to try to investigate that. And I think, as Hamza's mentioned, and also yourself, Jake, is that there is a problem. There's like an in-principle problem. The in-principle problem is this. Let me give you an example. If I've got a color red, yeah, I thought this bottle was red, but it's actually more purple. But if I've got this purple Ribena, yeah, shouldn't be showing that. We're not sponsored by them. So if we've got this, yeah, which is sort of a purpley color, yeah, we experience it as purple, yeah. Now, what's science going to tell us about this? Science is going to say, well, it has a particular reflection of light at a specific wavelength and a specific energy. It will tell me the properties of the light. None of those properties are related to my experience. Yeah. So there's an experience, there's an attribute that I'm sensing, which is not physical for the light itself. Yeah, it goes beyond the light, in essence, beyond the physical. So what science is going to tell me is going to give me a third-person objective analysis of some reality. But consciousness, my experience of this, is a first-person subjective experience. And there's nothing about the reflection of the wavelength of light and its energy that tells me I will experience it as being purple or red or whatever color. There's another problem. If I have a person who's been blind from birth and I try to describe that color, this color here, there is no language, there's no descriptive way to describe the color to the person who's never seen it. Yeah. So we've got another problem in terms of being able to describe something, because the language doesn't exist, because it is first person experience, which means if you've not experienced it or I've not experienced it, there's no way of being able to describe it, because there's nothing in the property that allows us to describe it as the experience that we're having. And that's not just like color, that's everything else as well. Taste, pain, as Hamza mentioned, having a coffee on a sunset after Maghrib, maybe with Salah and stuff like that. So, this is, so these things we don't any experience, these things we can't describe because the quality is not in the object. Yeah, it's within our own mind. So the question then becomes, well, how do I access the mind? Now, some people say, well, as Hamza mentioned about this correlation, about how the brain states tells us, if we work out the brain states, we can work out the correlation. Yeah. And this is the analogy that, strikes home to me is if I had ones and zeros, which are binary code for computer programs. Yeah. Now, there's nothing in the ones and zeros that tells me what the computer program is. You need something that occurs before the computer program, and that's the mind. That's the conscious ability to interpret the ones and zeros. It's like Morse code, dashes and dots. The dashes and dots are not going to give me information. What's going to give me information is the fact that I can interpret the dashes and dots into a language that I can understand. So I need a mind before the signals, whether that's signals in the brain, the action potentials and the neurons, or whether that is the ones and zeros on a computer. I need something that has already existed separate from the actual code in order to interpret the code. And the third example, or the third problem, is even if people are able to point to and say, okay, this neuron or these group of neurons in the brain, if they fire, they'll make you perceive the color purple. Yeah. But the problem is that the ability to say, well, okay, they're firing, how does that make it purple? It's like, and this is an example that Professor Donald Hoffman said, it's like you've got a bottle and you rub the bottle. Yeah. You rub the bottle and a genie pops out. Yeah, okay, fine. We rub the bottle, yeah, and the genie pops out every time. But you're not going to say that the bottle is causative of the genie. You're going to say, well, this phenomenon is occurring, and I can't necessarily connect the two. Yeah, and that's what's happening in regards to the hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness is the inability to, have the tools in science to access it. There's nothing within the properties of the reality or the brain that tells us how we're going to experience a reality. And even if we're able to show a correlation between the nerves and the neurons in the brain, we still don't have the ability to explain how this first person subjective experience comes about.
Right. So, yeah, that was a little bit more to tack on with this discussion about consciousness. I mean, there's so many different ways we can explain it. So I think each one of us giving our own perspective and describing the problem should be really helpful to the audience. But I really appreciate your explanation, Brother Sharif. Now, Brother Abdul, what are your thoughts on the question, can consciousness be grounded on materialism? What do you think?
Well, I think it can't, but I think this question really is the most essential question when it comes to these atheist discussions, because I think this is, as Brother Hamza and Brother Sharif mentioned, this is just an in-principle problem for science, which a lot of atheists do rely on to account for their naturalism, right? And like when we talk about cosmological arguments, you can conceive of, at least a naturalist account that at least gives you some sort of a causal chain back to some sort of beginning, and then they just cut the causal chain short at some arbitrary point. We think it's arbitrary, but at least there's a coherent picture there from their point of view. But my view is that on the consciousness discussion, they can't really get off the ground in the first place, because it's about a state of self-awareness that's just categorically unlike anything else in the natural world. And it is the starting point of our interaction with the world, right? And so, I mean, we start from this sort of like epistemic dualism that we already have our experiences of things and what the things themselves are, right? So it's for me, this poses an in-principle problem for science. And if we're going to define naturalism as, if naturalism is committed to the idea that everything in reality is explicable through natural means, or if they're committed to the causal closure of the physical, or if they say that everything is reducible to the physics and the chemistry that we see in the world, then this is the in-principle problem that they face, because you have this sort of qualitative leap when it comes to consciousness that you don't find in anything else really in the observable world. So like Brother Hamza mentioned, the wetness and these other, like, let's say, emergent properties that you can think of that can be a result of physical interactions. At the end of the day, you're not going to have that qualitative leap. They are going to be explainable in physical terms. And, we wouldn't disagree that a lot of those properties and a lot of those things are reducible to the physical. But when it comes to consciousness, and a lot of materialist philosophers like John Searle agree that it is really irreducible to the physical, because you can't reduce your experience of the physical to the physical. You actually couldn't possibly do that. And the in-principle problem comes for many reasons. It's because, first of all, you can't put consciousness under a microscope. I can put your brain under a microscope, but I can't put your experience under a microscope. So, and science relies on third-person perspectives in the first place, right? So consciousness is a first-person perspective thing. So you have an in-principle problem. And when you do have an in-principle problem, we're not saying that, this is a problem because of a lack of information that future science can solve. No, we're saying that you couldn't possibly solve it without some kind of radical paradigm shift that would kind of change the meaning of science as naturalists understand it right now, and maybe would be able to encompass some kind of supernaturalism, right? But science as it is right now, and naturalism as it describes the world in physical and chemical terms, and as they attempt to reduce everything to the material, couldn't possibly account for something that is so qualitatively unlike everything else in the physical world. And I think the bigger problem actually for me comes with when we talk about grounding rationality, right? And arguments from reason. And I know we put that in the poster. It is related, but I think that's really the bigger problem for naturalism, in the sense that it makes it really self-defeating if all your beliefs couldn't possibly be explained in non-rational terms or couldn't be reduced to it, then your belief in naturalism is self-defeating. So generally speaking, I think this is really the biggest problem for naturalism in general, and I think it's a more powerful of an argument, whether we're talking about consciousness or reason, than any argument against naturalism we could come up with.
I mean, I would agree with you. I think it's a huge problem for naturalism, and the way that I see it is that when we talk about consciousness, generally speaking, there's 5 states of consciousness. So there's things like sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and acts of will. None of which I think can reasonably be grounded on a materialist paradigm whatsoever. I mean, you guys have kind of gone into a lot of detail about that. But Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist philosopher, he's famous. He has this paper on what it's like to be a bat. And he explains that it's a sort of in principle problem that science and we could really never understand what it's like to be a bat, because in order to do so, you would need to be a bat. And we just don't even have the language to explain that. As you guys were talking about, science deals with what's called the third person perspective. And it only has language that can describe the phenomenon via this third person perspective, not by the first person perspective, which consciousness is. So it's an in principle problem that science can't really deal with the subject in a meaningful way to explain it whatsoever. And there's one thing that Brother Hamza mentioned, which is something that I like to focus on. It's something that I'm personally really interested in. And it's what you talked about, intentionality. And it's a bit difficult to understand. So I'm going to do the best that I can to explain it. But if you do the research on it, there's a well-known problem called the problem of intentionality. And basically the problem is, from a physicalist standpoint, how you can explain how the neurons in our brain would be intrinsically about things outside of our brain. And I'm gonna show you guys an example. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a book here by Alex Rosenberg, An Atheist Guide to Reality, which he describes this issue. He's got a diagram here, and he says, how can you understand how the top picture, which is the neurons in the brain, can be intrinsically about the bottom picture, which is Paris? And so he talks about the issue of the Paris neurons. And basically the neurons that are responsible, these neurons that are responsible for your thoughts about this physical object, which is Paris. Now, the question is, how on a physicalist paradigm do these thoughts in your brain, these neurons, how could they intrinsically be about Paris? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. It's so mysterious. And when you start to think about it more and more, you get to a point which he talks about in the book, that he makes the argument that on materialism, you can't actually think about anything whatsoever. And it devolves into sort of this, very strange picture. I'll just read one paragraph from this book. It's on page 179, and the title of the chapter is "The Brain Does Everything Without Thinking About Anything at All." And he says this to explain the problem that I'm talking about. He says, physics has ruled out the existence of clumps of matter of the required sort, meaning the clumps of matter that are used to talk about intentionality, the function of the brain in this case, which we would disagree with. But he's saying physics has ruled out the existence of clumps of matter of the required sort. There are just fermions and bosons and combinations of them. None of that stuff is just all by itself about any other stuff. There is nothing in the whole universe, including, of course, all the neurons in your brain, that just by its nature or composition can do this job of being about some other clump of matter. So when consciousness, and listen to this, So when consciousness assures us that we have thoughts about stuff, it has to be wrong. The brain non-consciously stores information in thoughts, but the thoughts are not about stuff. Therefore, consciousness cannot retrieve thoughts about stuff. There are none to retrieve, so it can't have thoughts about stuff either. And so what he's explaining to you is that on a physicalist paradigm and based on physics, you have to come to the absurd conclusion that you can't actually think about anything. But the very thought about not being able to think about anything is a thought about something itself. So the view devolves into this sort of self-refuting understanding. And so I'm just pointing out this one aspect that I actually think Rosenberg's conclusion is correct, that he's trying to give what he calls the atheist guide to reality, that if you are a physicalist, it results in the absurd position that you can't actually think about anything, which is ridiculous because most assuredly the words in his book have to be about something. Otherwise, what is he telling us? He's just wasting our time putting ink on paper, right? So, and then I do want to touch on an issue that results in this, which is what I think is the problem that you can't actually ground knowledge on materialism whatsoever based on this account of what we're talking about with intentionality. And I'm just going to give a very brief argument for this, is that knowledge is typically understood as justified true belief. Now, this means that knowledge assumes truth because in order for it to count for knowledge, it has to be true. Now, truth in the literature, for the most part, is understood as that which corresponds to reality. Now, this notion of corresponding to reality or matching up, meaning that the things in your brain match up to something real outside of it, assumes the function of consciousness intentionality, which is the thing that I was describing. Now, if the materialists cannot actually ground intentionality on their own paradigm, then that means they wouldn't be able to ground truth because truth assumes this sort of corresponding or matching up. Now, if it cannot ground truth, it cannot ground knowledge because knowledge assumes truth. So it's this domino effect in which if you cannot ground intentionality on a materialist paradigm, you cannot ground truth. And if you cannot ground truth, you cannot ground knowledge. And then therefore, atheists or materialists cannot actually ground knowledge on their paradigm whatsoever. Now, I know this is a little bit of a shift from consciousness, but I do want to point out because people may thinking, well, this is kind of an abstract concept. You guys are going into so much detail about consciousness. Is it really that important? And I'm saying, yes, it has massive implications for our ability to even ground the concept of knowledge or something like it. And so I do want to point that out. But yeah, so, in summary, I think we've done a great job of sort of explaining what the hard problem of consciousness is, the different facets related to it, some of the potential responses from a materialist that they could possibly make, what the problems with that are, and the implications of this in general, that we cannot ground things like intentionality, which results in not even being able to ground things like knowledge. So yeah, I do want to open it up back to you guys. We're at about the 40-minute mark. I don't know if there's anything else any of the panels here.
I just want to say something about the hard problem. In particular, it's not really a hard problem unless you're a materialist. And you can really see the significance of this question. I think over the past 100 or 200 years, the philosophy of mind in general in Western, contemporary philosophy, I think the whole domain of the philosophy of mind has been just an attempt to get as far away from dualism as they possibly can. And it was just a bunch of basically bandwagoning on these physicalist theories of mind very mindlessly, to the extent that they adopted some very radical and, how to put it nicely, like ridiculous ideas like behaviorism. Eliminative materialism is probably the worst, but I think identity theory is up there as well. Your mental states are identical to your brain states. I think that's just as ridiculous as eliminative materialism. And right now they shifted to things like what Brother Hamza mentioned with functionalism, which doesn't really deal with the problem. I mean, I can be a dualist and accept what you're telling me about functionalism, so it doesn't really deal with the problem of qualia. So I think, yes, it is a problem, and you can really see that from their very desperate attempt to get away from dualism. We're not saying it's a problem in general. We're saying it's a problem for materialism, and because they have so radically, invested themselves in this materialist worldview in general in the Western world over the past couple of centuries, all of their attempts in explaining consciousness have been basically attempts at getting away from any notion of dualism.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, to be a little bit more maybe reflective of what's going on in academia, there are a bunch of atheists that are not physicalists, believe it or not, right? So I try to mention this when I define atheism sometimes when we deliver courses, that yes, most atheists, practically speaking, are philosophical naturalists, but it's not the case that all of them are. So yes, to be an atheist, so to be a philosophical naturalist, you have to be an atheist. But to be an atheist, it doesn't necessarily entail that you're going to be a philosophical naturalist. So, for example, you have Professor David Chalmers, who adopts what you call the spooky thing called panpsychism. I don't know if you read about panpsychism.
Yeah.
Like, wallahi, I think some of these things are just God replacements, man. I'm telling you, the multiverse, panpsychism, all of this stuff. These are just like, almost conceptual replacements for God, really bad versions of them, right? Anyway, so I just wanted to just mention that because sometimes
Hamza, could you explain what panpsychism is, just in case audience members?
I think panpsychists have a problem in explaining what it is as well. But basically, panpsychists are basically saying, in a really brief nutshell, that you have physical properties in the universe, right? And you also have conscious properties in the universe, right? So some would argue there's a form of proto-consciousness in an electron. So an electron maybe can have a proto-consciousness of having an existential crisis. Why am I here? Why am I whizzing around? And I know that's a crude representation of it, but basically what they're saying is, in the physical universe, it's not just physical properties. You also have conscious properties, a form of proto-consciousness. The problem with panpsychism, and there are many problems, and they try to address them, is the problem of having a unified conscious experience. So if, for example, in the fundamental building blocks of the physical world, call them electrons or whatever you want to call them, if there's a form of proto-consciousness in them, then if they amalgamate together to form a human being, for example, how can you explain a unified conscious experience from that perspective? So panpsychism is some people just laugh at it, but it's actually gaining, I think, a little bit more traction. But the interesting thing that Brother Sharif mentioned, which I felt that he summarized everything beautifully, and he summarized the hard problem of consciousness really well. It really echoes, I don't know if you've heard of Frank Jackson's Mary's example, Mary Thought Experiment. So the Mary Thought Experiment is basically that she knows all the kind of science, if you like, and all the everything about color, everything about the visual processes from a kind of physical fact point of view. She knows all the physical facts about seeing color. She knows all the physical facts about the visual processes, and so on and so forth. But she's been in a black and white gray room all her life. She's never seen color in her life, yeah? But she is the master of understanding the physics and the biology and the chemistry and the physical processes concerning color and visual experience. Now, one day she's allowed to go out of her room and she sees a red rose for the first time. The question here is, does she learn something new? Does she now know what it's like to observe a red rose? Many people intuitively will say, yeah, it's the first time she's seen a red rose, so she's now learned, or she has knowledge or knowledge of an experience of what it's like to see a red rose. So this shows that knowing all the physical facts is not knowing all the facts. And there are facts other than physical facts. Now, obviously, in the literature, there are responses to this. One is called the ability hypothesis and so on and so forth, but they're really weak. But I think what's interesting, maybe to move forward, just as a suggestion, there are physicalist responses to our kind of attack or our understanding of the hard problem of consciousness. For example, eliminative materialism, reductive materialism, which I just summarized. I didn't really discuss why there's problems in these. And maybe we could allow for our guests who come on board to ask us those questions related to those approaches, or maybe we should summarize it ourselves. It's up to you. You're the host, but I don't want to preempt anything. But usually, people either talk from the perspective of an eliminative materialist point of view, reductive materialist, and they have their own arguments. Functionalism, emergent materialism, as some of them are quite, they think they have a good argument, but really, obviously they don't. But I don't know if you want to summarize them and respond to them now, or just leave that for later.
About the panpsychism, I just wanted to say really quickly that it's actually gaining so much traction to the extent that some people are actually proposing for that to be the basis for a scientific paradigm shift in order to allow us to account for consciousness. And I think my problem with non-physicalist atheist accounts of consciousness and reality is that they really blur the lines between naturalism and supernaturalism to the extent that, as I was saying earlier, if you're going to make that kind of a radical paradigm shift, you can even, include supernaturalism within your worldview as well. So we don't really have a meaningful distinction between the two at this point.
Absolutely. It makes theism far more credible in the secular academy, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you're willing to talk about panpsychism, well, there is another new phenomenon which you don't really find it in the online world, but it's in academia. It's called the phenomenal concept strategy. So Brian Law, he developed this thing called phenomenal concept strategy, and it's been developed by others now. But basically what the idea is that you have one property, which is a physical property in the universe. So it's a physicalist ontology, but they say you have two types of consciousness. So two types of concepts. So one concept is what you call a physical functional concept, and another concept is a inner subjective conscious experience concept. It's a phenomenal concept. So they say that when you observe a physical reality, the mind, what emerges from it is a physical concept and a phenomenal concept. So they're trying in so many different ways to try and understand all of these, or trying to respond to all of these points of view. And obviously they have their own problems as well. In actual fact, I had to write an essay on Brian Law's phenomenal concept strategy. And it's like, as Jake said in the beginning, I think it was Jake, it's a contradictory paradigm. Consciousness is the final frontier, if you like. Yeah. And maybe we could also discuss about artificial intelligence, because Professor John Searle's got the very famous Chinese room experiment argument, which I think is very powerful against a strong artificial intelligence. And I don't believe that they share these articles and take them seriously. Like, AI is going to be fully conscious like a human being. Like, I'm like, what on earth, right? And Professor Searle's Chinese room thought experiment is very powerful as well. Maybe we could get to discuss that later as well, inshallah.
And John Searle is a materialist, right? So he
John Searle's panpsychist.
No.
No, I think he's emergentist. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
He believes it's not reducible. But I don't know how that's materialism either. But whatever, we can get into that later.
Yeah, that's the thing I was gonna actually comment on, is because both what Abdul and Brother Hamza were saying is that I agree with you that there's accounts from a atheist naturalistic paradigm in which they allow for some of these things, like John Searle's emergentism. The problem is that they're starting to muddy the waters. And from what I see in my research in academia is that the naturalists are actually starting to move closer to what we would call supernatural. Things like the consciousness being immaterial, even panpsychism. To me, it just confounds the problem even more, because it's saying, well, not only is our brain or human beings conscious, but every little tiny molecule is some kind of has some level of consciousness in it. Well, it doesn't really, to me, it just makes it even more difficult for me, from my perspective, to fit in a naturalist ontology, because once you allow for something like that, then most of your arguments against theism or supernaturalism seem to fade away, because you have a lot of the same things within your ontological scheme. And so the way I see it is, well, yeah, naturalism is starting to move closer to supernaturalism, but it's in doing so, it's losing ground to criticize the theistic picture. And so that's what the issue is. I think it's better to try to push the naturalist more towards what Rosenberg is saying, and you guys may disagree, but I think it's to try to show them, well, no, once you start redefining terms in such a way that you can be a materialist and also be a panpsychist, then what does materialism really mean at that point? I think we start to lose track of the distinction between the terminology. So what I try to do normally is I try to push them towards, well, no, this is, a hard physicalist picture is really what the true understanding of naturalism would be. Otherwise, okay, you can move closer towards me, but then don't try to criticize me on my picture of God or angels or things like that, because you guys are allowing for this,
I don't know
molecule.
I don't know if you remember it, Jake, but I think you were on the call and we were having a discussion with an atheist friend of ours. I think he was an ex-Muslim who was like a proponent of panpsychism, and I was talking to him, and he accepted cosmological arguments generally. He accepted that there is a necessary foundation for reality, and then I think he sort of forgot that he was a panpsychist. I'm like, so you believe that there is some kind of a conscious cause or a conscious necessary foundation? And he was like, he really hesitated. I'm like, even if you say it's some kind of a proto-consciousness, we're really blurring the lines here between what it is to be a naturalist and a supernaturalist, because right now you believe in a conscious foundation for reality. So do I. Now let's talk about what the nature of that, which theory better explains the data, since we have this huge common ground, right? So I do think the reason I think philosophers like Graham Oppie are very good at building this common ground is because he's very straightforward in his definitions of what it means to be a naturalist and a supernaturalist. When he says he believes in a natural initial item, as he puts it, that created the universe or that caused the universe, he explicitly says that it's a non-conscious initial item. So I can work with that, right? But then when you say, it can be anything, and you just slap the label natural on it, I'm just not sure how that can be philosophically useful for a discussion.
Yeah. In fairness to them, if they adopt panpsychism, they've already moved away from materialism anyway. Because panpsychism is not considered a physicalist conception of the philosophy of the mind. So they've already moved way away from materialism to the panpsychist. That's for sure. Right.
Yeah. And the issue with that, like I said, is that one of the things that I'm noticing is that you have people like Chalmers moving towards panpsychism. And what I see from the theistic paradigm is, even with all the new scientific evidence, even the philosophical discussions, our view, for the most part, has stood the test of time. All of these things like consciousness and what we're talking about now fit very nicely and neatly within a theistic ontology, whereas they don't for naturalism, and naturalism is the thing that is having to make room for it, where all along we're just saying, well, yeah, guys, this is what we've been saying for thousands of years pretty much. So I see that as a genuine thing that people should be paying close attention to, in the sense that naturalism seems to be moving a bit more towards the supernatural and not having as clear of a hard line in between those two things, whereas we are perfectly fine with it, and it fits very nicely in our ontological structure. So
I want to ask Brother Hamza a quick question, maybe before we bring guests on, because generally, when we talk about consciousness or arguments from reason, they're generally arguments against naturalism, and not necessarily a direct. We don't have a direct route to God necessarily. It's not like a direct inference. I don't know if you disagree with that, but how would you turn this discussion about consciousness to an inference to to theism, basically?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, what I would do is, it depends what kind of conception of non-physicalistic conception of the mind you adopt. So if you adopt a dualistic integrated type of dualism, so an integrated type of dualism which basically says that your ontology is that there are physical properties and non-physical properties, but at the same time we can still engage with the project of neuroscience in order to understand, you know, how the brain works and so on and so forth, but with that kind of metaphysical backdrop that there are physical and non-physical properties, and all of that makes sense together. So, you know, can you adopt a kind of integrated type of dualism, like Professor Taliaferro and others? Yes, you can. Can that be a good argument for God's existence? Well, from a metaphysical point of view, one would say, well, you know, what is metaphysics really? It's like your first principles. It's like your kind of first principle framework, if you like, your lenses in order to understand reality. It coheres well with understanding yourself, reality, and how you relate to reality. So one would argue, does integrated dualism make sense under theism? And then you'd have to make an inference between the two and make a connection between the two. And you'd have to show how it's some kind of metaphysically necessary. And I don't mean that in a kind of philosophical sense necessary, yeah? Mm-hmm. How it's metaphysically necessary to bring in theism in order to upgrade and enhance your metaphysics and make sense of integrated dualism. That's how you would make the link. You say, fine, okay, we believe in dualism, we believe in non-physical and physical properties, and we also believe that you could do the science to understand the physical, no problem. So neuroscience is not thrown under the you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it has its scope because it only can deal with the physical stuff, no problem. Right, what makes sense of that? What makes sense of the fact that there are non-physical properties in the universe and physical properties in the universe, and we've been given a mind to do the science in order to understand the physical stuff? What makes sense of that? Then you say, well, God makes sense of that. How? And then you'd have to talk about, well, who is God, and what are the kind of, you know, essential names and attributes of God that would make sense of integrated dualism, for example. So you can say that theism, a theistic type of integrated dualism, actually makes sense. But that's how you would have to try and do it, and that would be a starting point.
And when we bring rationality into the picture, I think it just makes it much stronger, right? Like, because it's not right now, it's not just self-awareness. You have self-awareness, but also these truth-bearing faculties that we've been given. And if they are reliable, then I think that just makes the case for a rational foundation of reality just much stronger.
Well, yes, it depends if. Because funny enough, I did an essay on this. So Michael Dean, he did a response to Plantinga and Stitch on the issue of basically reliable cognitive faculties. So does natural selection, can it basically explain the fact that we have truth-bearing cognitive faculties? We have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce true beliefs, right? Reliable true beliefs. And obviously, you know, Plantinga's argument, you know, Stitch's argument. I think Plantinga goes too far, in my view. He goes way too far. I think there is a middle ground. I think the thing that we should suggest is that if you're going to adopt a naturalistic explanation, like the Darwinian mechanism to explain your truth-bearing cognitive faculties that could produce reliable true beliefs, they have to basically adopt skepticism, which really undermines their claims about religion and their claims about other things, right? But that's a big topic. That is actually quite a lengthy topic.
Because if you think Plantinga went too far, then I'd say you'd probably say the same about C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis makes basically an incompatibility argument between reason and naturalism, that it's not a probabilistic argument that reliable rational faculties would be unlikely under naturalism. He says that they're completely incompatible, as in it's impossible. So would you make that strong claim, or would you make more?
From my reading, and it could be totally wrong, I would say that's a bit too far. That's a bit too far. So, but both would have to actually provide some evidence for their position. The best thing that you can do, I think, which is safest philosophically, is just to say you can't claim truth. You have to be a skeptic if you adopt natural selection as your primary mechanism to explain your cognitive faculties, your reliable cognitive faculties that supposedly bring about reliable true beliefs. If you believe natural selection leads to that, well, you have a problem. The safest thing you need to do philosophically is adopt skepticism. Yeah.
And you're talking about like a radical kind of skepticism, not a healthy kind of skepticism.
Yeah,
You're
no,
talking about like
absolute
a
radical.
global skepticism.
You can't make moral claims. You can't make truth claims. You can't even make claims. You should go to sleep. Don't enter the debate. You're not in the forum. You don't even have the keys to the house of reason. You've lost the keys to the house of reason, my friend.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'll show you the essay I did for that. It's quite interesting. It was for university, but yeah, so I think it's a little bit too far. But to be honest, if we bring it up now, so it will just divert us to a totally different topic.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah,
have
I
to
agree.
talk about other things which would be quite crazy. So, but yeah, so I mean, I think we're there. I mean, we've explained what the hard problem of consciousness is. Two main problems. What is it like for a particular conscious organism to have an inner subjective conscious experience, and how and why do these inner subjective conscious experiences arise from seemingly cold, non-conscious physical processes? Physicalism can't answer that. You have eliminative materialism, which just denies the fact that you have inner subjective conscious experiences. Obviously, they got more to say, but we could unpack that when we speak to people today. We got reductive materialism, you got functionalism, you got eliminative materialism, and inshallah we'll be able to deal with these when we get people on board. There's no point unpacking them right now. But yeah, let's do that.
Inshallah. All right, so we got Elmo here in the stream. I'm going to add you, Mr. Elmo.
Just maybe a reminder as well to the guests to try to keep their comments, questions short, unless you want to engage in a pushback and critique the points.
Yeah. So how's it going, Elmo?
Hey, Elmo, what's up?
Hey, man. Yeah, I just came from Justin's debate with a Christian. I moderated, but I wanted to join here, but you got well. Thanks for having me back, guys.
No problem. So I don't know how long you've been watching, but we're talking about consciousness and whether or not it can be grounded on materialism. Did you have a particular comment or question?
I guess to Hamza, in this case, then you talked about like how would we link, I guess, or directly correlate integrated dualism with theism? Can you clarify like how you would do that for yourself in your own belief system?
No, I just don't have it in my head. I didn't really prepare for the God's existence stuff, to be honest.
All right.
So I'll leave it to someone else to answer. I'd have to think back what I wrote in one of my chapters for my book, which had to do with the fact that, if God is an all-aware being and is an all-knowing being, does it make sense that he created organisms that have a mind, that have a brain, that can also be aware of themselves as well? Does that follow? So it's along the lines of that. Now, one would then argue now, well, how do you know there is this kind of all-aware being that can bring into existence beings with minds that can be aware of themselves? But that misses the point of actually having a coherent metaphysic to explain reality, because if you continue like that, then you'd have no metaphysical assumptions, and therefore you'd have no understanding of most of reality. So you need what they call a metaphysical stopping point that makes sense of reality. So I haven't really prepared for it. I don't really remember what I wrote or stuff. So you'd have to ask someone else, to be honest.
Okay, so can you tell me like what your definition of consciousness is? Like what exactly is consciousness for you, I guess?
Consciousness. Okay, so echoing Professor David Chalmers, he makes a distinction between the easy problems and the hard problems. Okay. So when he discusses the problems of consciousness, he elaborates on what consciousness is. So with regards to the easy problems, is that you're able to think. You have a stream of thoughts. You have the ability to perform cognitive functions that result in thinking, such as mathematical thinking. You can make inferences. You can make deductive arguments. You can conceptualize, you could infer, you could deduce, you can reflect, you can ponder, you have memory, for example. That's another aspect connected
Mhm.
to consciousness. And then the other aspect is that you have what you call the experience, the inner subjective conscious experience. So for example, when you eat a marshmallow, something is happening obviously to your physical senses, something is happening in your brain for sure, but you're also undergoing a particular experience eating that nice soft, I don't know, strawberry flavored marshmallow, whatever kind of marshmallow you like, right? So there's the inner sub inner inner subjective experiences like pain and pleasure, and the experiences of having, I don't know, a romantic dinner with your wife or whatever the case may be, right? And then you have the easier problems, which, you know, one would argue functionalism may address, or the other kind of physicalist ontologies may address, which include things like, you know, we have a stream of thinking, of conscious thought, we can infer, we can deduce, and so on and so forth. So that would basically hopefully summarize what it means when we're saying consciousness.
So can I ask you? So you said that for the easy definition, like it's the ability to think. So would you say that a computer, you know, that a very complex computer is a? Would you say that's something that's able to think, you know, have these stream of cognitive functions, or would you say that like consciousness is only limited to biological material and not something like a microchip?
It's a very good question. Well, it depends what you mean by thinking. So if
Mm-hmm.
thinking you relate it to meaning, and to meaning you relate to intentionality, then computers
Mm-hmm.
don't do anything like that. Computers are just about syntactical arrangements. So
Mm-hmm.
the basis of all computer programs are zeros and ones. So it's based on
Mm-hmm.
syntax, in other words, symbols. It's just a rearrangement of zeros and ones. Do these zeros and ones, are they aware of their own zero and one, and or are they aware of something outside of themselves, right? Do they have an ability to attach meaning to the symbols? And that's a kind of interesting argument in consciousness. So, you know, as brother Sharif mentioned earlier, he eloquently talked about the kind of computer system and the zeros and ones. And when it comes to computer systems, the problem that you have is that really you need a mind to interpret the zeros and ones anyway. You need an external mind to do that. And that's why William Hasker, he makes a really good point. He basically says that computer programs or computer systems are just a protraction of human consciousness anyway, of human rationality anyway, right? So can computers think like us? Of course not. Can they do kind of abstract reasoning based on the syntactical arrangements and come up with, you know, very fast kind of solutions to complicate algorithms? For sure. Can computers be seemingly more intelligent than humans in this particular way? 100%. They're already showing this. But what do you mean by thinking? If you're talking about meaning and intentionality as well, which is the kind of, you know, the conscious stream of thoughts, right? Then absolutely not. Because let me show you what I mean by making a distinction between syntactical and semantic arrangements. So for example, let me give you 3 sentences in language. Se agaboboli, seni çok seviyorum, and I love you a lot. So that's Greek, Turkish, and English, okay? They all have the same meaning, which is I love you a lot. Now say you only know English. If I give you the Greek alphabet and I tell you to put sigma, which is the S, sigma, epsilon, right, which is like the E, then have a space, and I'll tell you take the alpha and put it here. Take the gamma, put it next to the alpha. Take the alpha again, put it next to the gamma. So I could train you on, without even talking about meaning, on arranging those symbols in a particular way. By virtue of you knowing how to arrange those symbols in a particular way, it will never give rise to the meaning of I love you a lot. You just never know, because you'll have no way of attaching the meaning to those symbols, right? So that's an interesting distinction to make between syntactic and semantic arrangements. And computer programs are very similar. They're based on basically zeros and ones fundamentally. And even when you talk about machine learning and all of these crazy, beautiful terms that you learn about now in artificial intelligence, it's still reduced to zeros and ones arranged in a particular way. So just to wrap this up, Professor John So developed a really powerful thought experiment. He was on a plane, I think, when he was thinking about this, and it's called the Chinese room experiment. And he wanted to make a distinction between strong AI and weak AI, which is the kind of distinction that we're making now. Can computers really think like we do, kind of thing? And the Chinese room experiment, in summary, is this: you have someone in a room, and there are Chinese speakers outside of the room. And the Chinese speakers are giving questions in Chinese to the person in the room. The person in the room does not know Chinese, but they do have an English rule book. And the English rule book is telling him, when you see a squiggly thing plus another squiggly thing that looks like this, then give some cards out to the people outside of the room that include these squiggly things. So he's got a rule book that teaches them how to look at the shapes and the syntactic arrangement of the symbols and shapes of Chinese, the characters, and the rule book tells them, if you see this type of kind of arrangement, then give them these characters. Now, the people outside of the room, every time they ask a question, they're getting the right answer. So the people outside the room who know Chinese, they think the person in the room actually knows Chinese, but he doesn't. He just has an English rule book that helps him deal with the kind of syntactic arrangements, not the semantic arrangements, because he has no way of adding semantics to syntax, right? So that shows that the computer system can do complex symbolic arrangement or syntactic arrangements, but there's no way of attaching meaning to the symbols. Now, one would argue, there is a reply to this. It's called the systems reply. And one would argue is, well, doesn't the whole system know the meaning? Well, what does that mean? There is no way of the system attaching meaning to the symbols in any shape or form. Even if the rule book was in the person's head, they would still not know Chinese, the meaning of those words, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah. So
yeah, Elmo. I just want to say that we've got a bunch of people waiting, so we're gonna have to move on to the next guest. But
sorry.
I do appreciate you calling. No problem, brother Hamza. But I do appreciate you calling in and asking some questions.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Elmo.
Take care,
Take care,
Elmo.
man.
Nice to meet you, Hamza.
Take care.
All right, we're going to go to Muzzy here. Hey, Muzzy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. So, what I wanted to ask you is, how do you not reconcile in a way, but square up this idea of, like traumatic incidents to like people who have had like brain injuries, who have lost their, in a way, sense of self. Like there was a famous incident back in the 1800s when someone got a pole through the head, and it was a train. It's quite famous. They teach it in psychology, medical school, literally everything. And he had a pole go through his brain, and his perception changed. But he was still himself, but something changed about him. So I was thinking if they could use this as an argument to say that there's something physical about consciousness. But just another interesting thought. Obviously, I'm like a medical school student. I'm in my fourth year. So when you study conjoined twins who are conjoined to the brain, it's interesting that they still have this individualistic will despite sharing motor functions in the brain, which is quite interesting. But then obviously I was going to ask you about the thing about traumatic brain injuries to see what you guys think.
Yeah. I don't know who wants to tackle it first, if anybody.
I'll just say one sentence that I think, if I'm not misunderstanding this, I think this is more related to the easy problem of consciousness, because we do acknowledge that there are interactions and there are correlations between the physical aspects of our neural activity and our consciousness, and this is more a question to do with personal identity and mental continuity and stuff, which I think is a problem that is related to consciousness, but it's not. I don't think it's like the hard problem of consciousness itself, which deals with like self-awareness and qualia. But it's a good question. I don't think it directly tackles the hard problem of consciousness. All it shows us is that there are correlations between our neurological activity and our perceived personal identity, or even our consciousness, which we do acknowledge. Dualists don't deny that there is some kind of a correlation or an interaction or interdependence between the physical and the non-physical.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
any any of those scientific medical examples do not in any shape or form undermine the kind of independence of non-physical consciousness and the physical brain. It doesn't undermine it at all in any shape or form. And a really easy thought experiment is to think about someone driving a car, right? So in order for so you have a driver and you have a car. In order for the driver to start driving the car has to work, right? If the car doesn't work and the driver is okay, then the driver is not going to go anywhere. Conversely, the car, even if it's working and the driver's dead, right? The car's not going to go anywhere. So that's a really interesting, simple way of showing that the guy in the car is like the mind, and the car itself is like the brain. Yeah, just because they need each other to kind of function in the physical world, it doesn't mean they're the same thing. And that's why you can make a very clear distinction between the driver and the car. Just because the brain is damaged, in this case, maybe the car's damaged, maybe, I don't know, the gear stick's not working properly, something's going to happen. The driver, he may be a fully functional, great driver, but if the gear stick's not working properly, then the car's not going to be moving that well, right? So these examples in medicine, even in medical history, do not undermine in any shape or form the fact that consciousness can be independent to physicality in any shape or form. And yes, I would echo what Abdul said as well. Even if they were to try and make that claim, still doesn't undermine, doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, which is, what is it like for an individual human being to have an inner subjective conscious experience, and why do these phenomenal conscious states, inner subjective conscious states, arise from neurobiological physical things in the first place? So that would be my answer to that particular question.
Right. And even when you have cases like when they remove half of someone's brain, it's not like you have half of the consciousness or half of the person. There's still a unified consciousness. So if you thought that there was a direct correlation, we would expect to find something different. And interestingly enough, there are some people, you can actually look it up. I forget the name of the brain disorder or issue, but there are people that actually only have 10% of the normal brain matter, and yet they can function to up to 75% as quote unquote normal as we would with a full brain. So if that were true, we would expect to see something radically different than that. So I think that also helps to understand and capture what's happening.
Well, to throw something a span in the work. Oh, sorry, Sharif. Just very quickly, to throw something as a span into the works, there's this new thing called neurocardiology that's been discussed for the past 20 or 30 years or something. Yeah. That the heart now has its own brain. It's got like 40,000 neurons, right? And I think
stomach as well.
Sorry?
The stomach as well.
Yeah,
apparently
the stomach. Would you believe it?
Yeah.
And it's very interesting when you refer to some hadith talking about the stomach, right? The stomach lied, right? Now, obviously, there's an interpretation to that, but it just gives a different spin to these hadith. So the heart, you know, and neuroscientists, by the way, I haven't studied this properly. It's in the literature. It's in the medical literature. They're not studying this properly. It's actually cardiologists that are studying the kind of the brain of the heart, if you like. It's got about 40,000 neurons. And this just shows the scientific method is based on induction. We'll have new data that can undermine previous conclusions. It's in flux. So God knows, you know, and that's why there's been some evidence to show, I'm not saying it's conclusive, but when people have heart transplants, people's memories, they have different memories or slight personality changes as well. So, you know, what they're going to say about that? That now consciousness is in the heart? Okay, well, thank you. That's like the Islamic paradigm. Jazakallah khair. You see my point? I just want to throw that in there because that's very interesting. Sorry, bro.
Yep. And Muzzy, you can make a quick comment, and then we're going to have to go to the next guest if you have any final thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say with what you said about it's they split the corpus callosum, which is the band of like nerve fibers in the middle of the brain. And you're right, consciousness doesn't really split. And I've seen atheists try to redefine it and saying that we've discovered that consciousness changes, but they mean like certain like physical, emotional experiences because you're affecting the physical brain. So they tried to redefine the term. But yeah, it's funny that even when you split the brain, the consciousness is still unified.
Yep. All right. Well, appreciate you coming on and asking your question, Muzzy. I guess we'll talk to you another time. Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Just really quickly before you move on to the next guest, really quickly, I just wanted to make one point. which is I think the discussion here is not necessarily about whether if you affect the neurons, are you going to affect certain perceptions or emotional states. I think the discussion is that does the brain state, does the physical matter of the brain, does it provide us the complete picture of consciousness? Can it bridge the gap between understanding the physical processes of the brain and consciousness itself? And the point being is that it doesn't. And it's not because we just don't know the science enough, it's because it's an in principle problem. There's an unbridgeable gap. Yeah. So you can, so even if, I think there was a question somebody asked in a comment when we were advertising this stream, he said, well, yeah, but you could, do a head transplant, yeah, and you could, take the consciousness of a person into another person. I said, okay, look, even if they were able to do this, it still does not explain consciousness, yeah. And I think Hamza's example of the car and the driver is a very good example in order to explain that point. It's not really explaining where that consciousness comes from. It's just simply explaining that one of the facets or the vehicle by which consciousness comes into the world is through a brain.
Right. All right, we're going to go to the next guest. We've got Adnan here.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I have a quick question. What do you guys think is the Islamic definition of consciousness? Not like the philosophical, in terms of the Western tradition, but what is the Islamic? Like, where is somewhere we can point in the Quran and Sunnah and say this is consciousness? That's my question, basically.
I don't know which one you guys want to start to address that. That's a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
I think the question is when we're talking about consciousness, are we talking about a phenomena that we can ascertain from the mind by our investigation? Or are we talking about a phenomena that requires some textual information to inform us about? For example, when we talk about angels, malaika, that's not something that I can sense rationally, or scientifically in order to come to the conclusion that angels exist. That comes from the text. So because it comes from the text and the text informs us, we don't try to rationalize it. Now, other things that we can sense and we can understand, for example, the earth is round, or is a sphere, then we can sense these things. So then we can interpret and understand that from the reality. So this would be considered dalil aqli, rational evidence, as opposed to dalil naqli, which is like textual evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, there may be an overlap, so there are certain things that the text will refer to which are phenomena that you can sense within the real world, And one of those may be the aspects of consciousness or the fitra of a human being, where, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that every human being is born upon fitra. Now, there is ikhtilaf, difference of opinion as to what the fitra means. Some explain it to mean the desire to worship one God. Some believe it's the innate, instinctual behaviors within human beings. Others say it's the aql, the mind. There's discussions within the mentions in the Quran about the qalb, the heart. Some explain this to be like the rational center, the ability to make those thinking processes. So there are things that the text may say which has some correspondence to reality. So if we can try to harmonize the two, being sincere to the text and also correct to the reality. If there isn't, then it's a textual matter which we believe in, and we don't try to superimpose upon the text. So the original discussion about consciousness is a discussion that exists, that we can sense, we can talk about in the real world, irrespective of whether we've got revelation or not. So that's where the area of knowledge exists. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, that there are signs for ulul albab, people of thinking, of depth, yatafakkarun, people of thought. So there's mentions many points about this phenomena of being able to think and come to certain conclusions and being rational and come to conclusions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. The Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Either there's a rational process that's going on in the mind. I don't know if Hamza wants to add or mention anything further.
No, I think that was very good, bro. I think just to add to that, I think some brothers, they mistakenly... Yeah, sure. So some brothers and sisters, they think that when we talk about this issue, Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Can
can
you guys
hear
hear
you.
me? I think there's a bit of a lag.
I think there's a lag.
Okay,
Sorry,
good, yeah.
Hamza, but
So-
we can hear you.
Oops.
Oops, looks like we lost him there. Yeah, sorry about that, brother. But
Adnan, has that answered your question, or because
Yeah,
what
yeah,
it is, the temptation is to talk about nafs and ruh, yeah. But we have to
exactly.
be careful whether these things are something that's mentioned in the text, yeah, and they're talking about the phenomena of consciousness, or they're just talking about the text that's mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah. But we shouldn't try to interpret it or rationalize it in the way. So Hamza's back now, so I think inshallah we can go back to Hamza.
Yes, sorry. So basically, some people conflate the whole consciousness issue with the reality of the ruh and the soul. And we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about the ruh, he said it's the command of your Lord and you've been given just little knowledge. So we're not going into the in-depth, what is this, the nature of the soul and the essence of the soul, the makeup of the soul. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created the soul and created us, is telling us we've been given very little knowledge. What we're doing is, if you read the Quran and the Sunnah, just like what Brother Sharif said, our understanding that we have the ability to have inner subjective conscious experiences is assumed throughout the Quran and the Sunnah. It's assumed throughout the Quran and the Sunnah. In so many different hadith, so many different ayat in the Quran, the issue of that we have inner subjective conscious experiences is assumed in the Quran and the Sunnah. So even if you wanted some kind of textual evidence, then you can go to the texts and understand, right, what is the assumption here? Well, the assumption is that there is a conscious human being that has an ability to have inner subjective conscious experiences. And that's not necessarily the same as saying, oh, we're going to know what the essence of the soul is now. No, this is beyond us because it's part of the unseen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that we have been given just little knowledge about the ruh. So I just wanted to add that because people usually mention that as some kind of, you can't talk about this, it's un-Islamic because Allah says you can't talk about the ruh or you don't have much information about it. But hopefully I've made that distinction, inshallah.
Yep. Want to add a very small part, just because it's important to contextualize these discussions. And as I mentioned earlier, that the hard problem of consciousness is only a hard problem as far as materialism or science is concerned. The Quran doesn't really need to come down and tell you that there is consciousness or what consciousness is. You need to be conscious to read the Quran, right? And the common sense understanding of our experience is a dualistic understanding. Like, people commonsensically have a dualistic ontology of the world. The problem comes, the radical shift comes, is when the materialist comes and says that no, everything is reducible to the physical. Now, that radical shift, that's not something that you find, that's not a fitri thing that you found throughout human history. It's not widespread in that sense. So the Quran is not, it doesn't come down to give you these things about the fitri aspects that we already know. We have to be conscious in order to read the Quran or receive it or whatever. And as Brother Hamza said, what consciousness isn't really this discussion. And I don't think we can ever say that, because Allah says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. It's from the command of my Lord. It's not something we can ever come to know about in detail. But the question is, what worldview best accounts for this reality, and what worldview is completely incompatible with this reality. I think that's the issue. But the existence of consciousness or self-awareness is something that's kind of taken for granted everywhere.
Yep. All right, brother. Well, we appreciate the question. We're going to have to move on to the next guest now, but thanks for calling in. All right. Assalamu alaikum, brother. Okay, let's move to Tushar we have here.
Hello, guys. Hi. Thanks for having me. It was
How you
great.
doing?
I'm right. Not
Hey.
too bad. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I think I'm here first time with you guys. Probably. Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
Do you have a comment or question?
Yes. Comment. Consciousness, as your topic today is consciousness is a miracle. I don't think so. It's a miracle. When he said can you please explain when David Chalmers said the hard problem of consciousness, what that means?
I'm sorry, you said, can we explain the hard
Yeah,
problem of consciousness from
yes,
David
yes,
Chalmers?
yes. What that means when David Chalmers say hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, Brother Hamza touched on it earlier. I don't know if you heard it, but maybe he can just repeat it again for you.
Please, if you can, yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
not
sure,
very
actually.
briefly, like it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Please.
I'll pull out his quote for you. It's right in front of me. So,
Okay.
David Chalmers, what he says about consciousness is as follows. He says, the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is aware of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect. This subjective aspect is experience. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations, the felt quality of redness, the experience of dark and light, the quality of depth in a physical field.
Yeah.
Other experiences go along with perception in different modalities, the sound of a clarinet, the smell of mothballs. Then there are bodily sensations from pains to orgasms, mental images that are conjured up internally, the felt quality of emotion, and the experience of the stream of conscious thought. And what he said is as follows. What unites all these states is that there is something it is like to be in them. All of them are states of experience. If any problem qualifies as the problem of consciousness, it is this one. In this central sense of consciousness, an organism and a mental state is conscious if there is something it is like to be in that state. And in his other works and in the same literature, he talks about that's one of the main problems of the hard problem, which is what we don't know what it's like for a conscious organism to have a particular inner subjective conscious experience. And you also have, for example, Thomas, you have Professor Alter, when he talks about the ontological problem, and he says, how does my brain's activity generate those experiences? Why those and others? Indeed, why is any physical event accompanied by conscious experience? The set of such problems is known as the hard problem of consciousness. So those are the
Brother
two
Hamza,
main...
just sorry to interrupt you. You spot on. You explain all the whatever. I've also read David Chalmers and everything. You explain all the parts which is subject to the brain. The hard problem of consciousness, the part you missed. I'm sorry, with the precisely I'm saying that. The hard problem of consciousness is who experienced the blankness. Neuroscience is stuck on that. What you said, this is right, absolutely right. Whatever have we experienced dreams, taste, love, emotions, everything is we have found it. There are some neurons in your brain which experience that. Now, let me explain you that, if you don't mind. So where the issue come from? Issue come from when we are awake, as you are awake and we are all awake, we experience the world with our senses. I think someone typing behind. Is it? Yeah, thank you. So when we experience the world, we experience with our senses, with our smell, we look at things, we touch things. So we experience that. So this is what we call awakened world. And then we have a dream world where you dream the things like, which is imagined by your brain. And you also experience that as it is as it has happened. Like, let's say you wake up tomorrow morning and you say, oh, I had a dream last night and I felt about it. Like, probably you gone for holiday or you had a bad nightmare or whatever. You experience that. But your only brain, imagine this. But the problem comes from when you didn't have a dream. Like, let's say you slept one night and you wake up in the morning and you said, I didn't have a dream last night. Now the problem come here. How do you know you didn't have a dream? When your brain not active, your body is not active. So that's the hard problem of consciousness, which means the sciences agree to there is something which witnessed the blankness, but we cannot establish that.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the correct reading of the current literature. From my understanding, the hard problem is based on two main questions, which is, what is it like for me to have a particular conscious experience? And what is it like for you to have a particular conscious experience? So, for example, we could have the two identical meals. We could have a biryani, right?
Yeah.
So we both have the same biryani. I'm having an
I love
inner
that.
subject. I'm having an inner subjective conscious experience, and so are you. I know what my subjective experience feels like.
Hamza, my brother, just a second. But it is an experience.
But let me finish.
Yeah,
the
please.
problem is, so I just want to articulate the problem so you can understand the distinctions that are being made. The problem now is, if I were to try and find out what it's like for you to have the same biryani, knowing everything about your brain will not lead to me knowing about your particular experience, as we discussed earlier in this podcast.
Yeah, but it's still
The
subject to
second-
your senses. I'm sorry to interrupt you that, but it's still your senses experience. People can have a different taste. Maybe some people are gonna like biryani, some people not gonna like it.
Yeah, of course
Tushar,
it's- So
It is
Sorry,
subject
Hamza,
to
go.
your just a second, guys. It is subject to your senses, your taste, smell, touching. We all have that. We all have that. It can be different. That's nothing to do with but the conscious plays the important part. But we all experience that biryani with that conscious. It's in a I don't know how much. Okay, probably next time or whatever. But that's the point I want to make it. The problem, hard problem of consciousness is who witnessed the blankness. Who told you didn't have a dream last night? That's we are stuck in as a science.
I think no one's disagreeing with the fact that you need senses, you need and there is someone experiencing something. That's not undermining the fact that there isn't a problem. There is a problem.
Yeah.
The issue is when we use those senses and we have experiences, then can we know the reality of someone else's experiences by just using your own senses?
But we have nothing to do with the other's experience. It's all about ours. Your experience is always going to be different than mine.
Well,
but who's experiencing? That's the one thing. Look, for example, if I give you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let's say you eat in biryani, I eat in biryani. It depends on our likes and dislikes, good or bad. But we all have experience.
You guys are making me hungry.
I know. Yeah, me too. But this is please carry on.
We agree we're both going to have experience. So the question here is, the first part of the hard problem of consciousness is, then what is your experience like from my perspective? If I were to map out everything in your brain, understand all of your descriptions of that experience, it would never allow me to understand what it's like for you to have that experience. So what you're saying is exactly what we're saying. And that's one part of the hard problem. And the second part of the hard problem is, well, how do you have this inner subjective experience arising from a so-called physical brain? And a physical brain is based upon physical processes which are fundamentally blind and non-conscious. So you're right. So what you're saying is in a different way of what we're saying. So I think it's a slight misunderstanding in the way it's been articulated. But I agree with you. We're both having experiences for sure.
That's it. That's the main thing. Yeah.
But that's the problem. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tushar,
yes, please.
Do you agree that there is a hard problem of consciousness?
Beg your pardon. I think I missed that. Can you repeat the question, please?
I said, do you believe that there is a hard problem in
No. I don't.
You
think
believe
so.
it can be explained?
Yes, it's already explained.
By what?
Oh, it's already explained.
Yes. It's already explained.
So do you understand what Hamza said? Hamza said that your ability to taste and experience biryani is going to be different to the experience of Hamza. And even if you want to say that they're the same, there's no way you can describe them such that you can say that they are the same.
But we're not on about what is the taste of biryani. We are on about who experienced that.
No. In when we talk about hard problem of consciousness, there's two areas. There's one which is called qualia, which is our experience of the external. No, not first time, just experience of the world. If I see red, if I feel pain, this is an experience. It's called qualia. There's a first aspect of that Hamza mentioned. First problem also. So there's two parts of the problem. One is qualia. The other one is, how does physical, non-conscious matter produce consciousness?
Who does that?
So how does that? That's the problem. The problem is, how do you explain that? Can that be reducible to the neurons alone?
So okay, right. Now we are mixing it up. It is very simple. It's not rocket science. If you just put what awakened world experience, like what we awake now, that everybody will have a different. We agree to that. Even though, we all have different opinion on anything. That's our experience. And the dream world also, we'll have all experiences separately. But the question rises, who experienced the deep world, deep sleep world? We all have deep sleeps, but we don't know. We know who experienced that.
So who
That's the common experience.
Let me
ask you a question, because I'm trying to understand you.
Yeah, please.
You don't think that there's two things. Do you think there's a hard problem of consciousness and that it's been solved? or you don't think that there's even one to start out with. That's what I'm trying to get from you.
Well, there is no hard problem of consciousness. The only it is only hard problem of consciousness on the basis on the subject of science. Because according to science, there is no neuron.
Would you say on materialism that it would be a hard problem?
If you let me finish, my brother, all science is saying we don't have any neuron active when you go to deep sleep. So that's why we can't prove it. They acknowledge science. Science acknowledge consciousness. They say there is something which is experienced nothing, blankness. But we can't prove it because there's no neurons with that. That's why it's called that's why it says consciousness is not byproduct of your brain. It has nothing to do with your thinking, your likes and dislikes. That's what I want to say. That's it.
Maybe just to try to simplify it a bit further, I want to ask you a question, because you were saying it isn't rocket science. I think it's much more difficult than rocket science. I mean, rocket science you can explain fully in physical terms. I mean, there's no mystery in rocket science. It's difficult. I agree that it's difficult, but there's no mystery. But let me try to ask you this question. So let's say you're looking at a red car, right? So you have this experience of seeing a red car.
Yeah.
Now we both agree that there are these physical aspects that lead to the experience, as in the light hitting your retina and everything else that follows. I'm not very good with that. And then you experience the red car. Now the question is, from your perspective, just picture yourself looking at the red car.
Yeah.
Is your experience of that red car identical to the physical processes that are occurring? Are they the same thing?
Yeah, because you're experiencing that red car. As you and me.
But remember, I'm asking about your experience, Tushar's experience. Right now, Tushar is looking at the red car.
Yeah.
Would you say that this experience is literally the electrons and the atoms bumping into each other out there and leading to are they the same thing?
No, it's not the same thing.
Okay, so there's a gap. That explanatory gap is what we call the hard problem of consciousness.
My brother, what he's saying, when I look at the red car, but my senses say, my neurons say it is a red color. Well, it doesn't say red color. My neurons doesn't say red. We made up this word. And if I speak in Urdu or language.
Forget about the words.
Yeah.
Experience.
It's a experience. I agree to that. And as now we're speaking in English, we will call it red. Right?
Okay.
So this is the experience of my neurons. It's nothing to do with that. It is about my friend, it is all about who experience your brain. That's the main thing. Who experience your
I think Tushar,
try to understand.
Abdulrahman, just really quickly. Tushar, I think we're actually saying, I think we're saying the same thing here.
Yes.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that it's not a hard problem because, we know that there is a mind, in the person, independent of his physical product, physicality, that experiences things, that therefore, forget about, trying to explain how the physical causes the consciousness. There's just something called consciousness. There's just something called the mind. Is that what you're saying, Tushar?
No. It's no right. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name, my brother.
My name is Sharif. Yeah.
Sharif. Yeah. Look, mind have nothing to. Why the reason science says there's a hard problem of consciousness, because science cannot prove there is any neuron who experience emptiness. That's why they say it's a hard problem for us to prove. Because as you can understand, science need evidence to prove it. Anything if they have to prove, physical evidence. They need to go to the algorithms and they need to go formulas and stuff like that. So that's why they can prove it. The reason they're saying it's a hard problem because they can't prove it, but they acknowledge something experiences the blankness. That's the two different things.
Yeah, but brother, I think what you need to understand is it's a hard problem in relationship to materialism. Of course, we don't think it's a hard problem here because we have a good response to it based on our prior ontological commitments.
Yeah.
But the question is whether or not materialism can respond adequately to the hard problem of consciousness. That's what the question is.
Materialism have nothing to do with consciousness. We are not, put it like this way. If the time we didn't know that there's a gravity, because of gravity we walk on Earth. So you think we used to fly? We used to walk anyway. So it doesn't make any materialism have
I don't think you're understing the point.
Tushar, you need to understand the point that we're making.
Yeah, you're not understanding the point.
Even the philosophers of the mind, or the neuroscientists, is what they're saying is this: is that it's a hard problem because they can't bridge the gap between physical matter and conscious experience. They can't do that. That's the problem that they're sensing. Yeah.
That's
now,
it.
what you're
Because this is what I'm saying. They don't have any neurons to connect that. Well,
right.
it's
So,
very. It's
Are
like
you a
for-
materialist?
Tushar-
Tushar? Are you
Yeah,
a materialist?
No,
Are
no,
you
I'm
material?
not. I'm
Okay,
not.
then you don't have a hard problem of consciousness. You're good.
You what? Sorry.
If you're not a materialist, then you don't have a problem. We're in agreement. That's basically what we're telling you. We're
Yeah,
saying this is a problem for somebody who says that the world is entirely explainable by the physical and chemical processes that are out there. That is all you need to explain the world. Someone who says that is going to face a problem. You're not a materialist, so you're okay. So we agree that it's not a hard problem. If
Yeah,
Thank
do
you.
you think that materialists can explain it by purely physical means? That's the question.
Well, it's depend on them. I don't think so. Materialistic would be any bother about like anything to do with the consciousness.
Brother, it's not about being bothered. It's whether or not it's a philosophical problem. It's whether or not the materialist paradigm can account adequately for consciousness.
My
I
friend,
don't think that you can. I don't
Jack,
think that you think it can.
Jack. Well, it's depend on them. I don't know how they're gonna take it. But all I'm here to guys to add a bit, like my side of it into the conversation, and that's it. I don't know what they think, and good luck to them with whatever they think.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement, Tushar. So I think you're on our side here, and we're in agreement.
Yeah. I think we're gonna move
just
on
for
now.
the record, materialists do care to the extent that they come up with these very radical ideas. Like they would even deny the existence of mental states, like limited materialism.
If you guys talking about atheists, I don't buy anything from them. Like
okay, fine. Then we're on the same page.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page. You're just maybe articulating it a bit differently, but we're on the same page.
I didn't get that.
But I appreciate you coming on and asking questions.
Hello?
We're gonna have to move on to the next guest, though. All right, Tushar.
Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for coming on.
Take care. Let's see who we got here. I think we've got Mirza waiting. I think he's been waiting a while. How you doing?
Alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So I just have a question. So the discussion around consciousness and the heart problem, effectively we're saying that this is something that is coming from God himself, as in the source of consciousness. So if your opponents were to reply saying that you are effectively putting in a God of the gaps argument, how would you respond to that?
Well, we
Just
didn't
really
actually
Jay,
make it necessarily an argument for God.
is this Sultan that I know?
Yes, it's me.
All right. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, brother. It's good to have you on. So I think just Jake and for the other brothers. So he's asked a question: is this a God of the gaps argument? Yeah. So in essence, we can't explain this, therefore we're going to put God into it. So we can't explain conscious, we put God. I think and I'll let the brothers answer as well. But I think the issue is this: is that it's not a God of the gaps, because the God of the gaps presupposes that there's a point which we just don't know. But if we do a bit more investigation, we'll get the knowledge. Yeah, so it's a problem of just not having enough of the science so far. What we're saying here about consciousness is that it's an in principle problem. It's not a problem that can be bridged by greater knowledge. Yeah, so it's not going to be solved just by getting more and more information and more knowledge, but rather we won't be able, from a scientific point of view, access that knowledge. That doesn't necessarily mean that it points straight away, okay, therefore God exists. But what it does do is it provides greater indications that a creator exists. Especially, I think in our previous streams, we had discussions, and inshallah we're going to have another one about stage 2 of the cosmological argument. And if Hamza's free, it'd be great to have him to discuss that. But in stage 1 of the cosmological argument, where we came to a conclusion of a necessary being or necessary foundation, and then the question becomes, well, is it conscious or not? Well, you've got an added reason to believe that this necessary foundation, necessary being, would be conscious, because we can't explain consciousness by materialism. So for the existence of consciousness, you would need something to have caused it that itself is beyond quote unquote contingent or material beings, and therefore that would be a creator. Yeah, I think maybe let the other guys as well to answer that question as well from Sultan.
Yep. Yeah. I just want to point out that this is not necessarily the discussion we're having is not necessarily an argument for God. And Hamza touched on that a bit earlier, but it is an argument against materialism. That's what the argument really is. It's an argument against materialism, not necessarily an argument for God's existence. But what we would say, and Hamza kind of hinted at this earlier, is that in the theistic picture where we have this ultimate mind, in a sense, that is God at the very foundation of everything, that is responsible for creating everything, it fits much more naturally and nicely in a theistic picture of the world rather than an atheistic one or a naturalistic one. So it's more based on a worldview perspective of seeing which one fits more neatly and easily into one's ontology, given your prior commitments about the world. And I would argue that it, in a probabilistic sense, not in terms of making such a forceful, necessary argument, but I think we can see that consciousness fits much more easily and nicely with a picture of God being at the very beginning and center of everything and responsible for everything, rather than at a mindless sort of production out of nothing or whatever you want to say. So I think that's kind of what we're explaining. We're not even necessarily going into making an argument for God's existence. We would just say it's an argument against materialism, and that the overall structure of one's worldview, consciousness, fits very nicely with a theistic picture rather than an atheistic one. So I hope that answers your question, brother.
Yeah, that's
just a broader point there. Sorry, because I think this is important. This whole God of the Gaps thing is a really overused, cliche that sometimes atheists just think it's a trump card that can just destroy any argument. But the thing is, nobody here is saying that I don't know X, therefore Y. Nobody's saying that. What you can say, like if I say that based on the information I have, this is the best explanation. For example, if I make an abductive argument, that's not a God of the Gaps argument. And I also think that alongside the probabilistic arguments, there are deductive arguments. I'm going to have to read Brother Hamza's papers on that, but I think the deductive arguments, the C.S. Lewis style arguments from reason, are actually deductive arguments that make reason and naturalism incompatible, and the conclusion of these arguments, it actually concludes the existence of God, and that's also not a God of the Gaps argument. Of course, there were he made modifications to the argument. There were many responses to it. Peter Van Inwagen wrote a few papers on it. But I think all in all, I think it's a very solid argument that makes naturalism and reason in general, or the reliability of our reason, incompatible, and it concludes God in a non-question begging way, and it has nothing to do with God of the Gaps whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, brother. We appreciate your question. I think we're going to have to move on to the next guest now, but really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Assalamu alaikum. All right, so I'm going to go to Mo L real quick. We got here. Assalamu alaikum, Mo.
Alaikum salam. How you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
Okay, so I have a few comments I want to say, and hopefully brother Hamza Tzortzis can elaborate, So I believe that consciousness is mystical. Okay, it's from the divine at the end of the day, because or else if we deduce it materialistically, it becomes we're like zombie robots at the end of the day, biological zombie robots. You know what I'm saying? But nonetheless, it seems as if the academic atheists are presupposing things beside Allah, beside God, like panpsychism, for example, and they're taking baby steps towards Allah eventually, because that's the ultimate truth at the end of the day. Allah, you cannot presuppose something beyond that. And it's innate, and it provides a coherent worldview and foundational worldview at the end of the day. It's coherent, it's in line with our rational faculties. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is this. We have a concept that is panpsychistic as well. The angels and everything is conscious of Allah. all the material things in this world is conscious of the ultimate being. So this panpsychism doesn't provide a justification still. You know what I'm saying? So this is all I wanted to say. If Hamza can elaborate and emphasize more on what I said, that would be great. Thanks. Assalamu alaikum.
Mr. Mo L, my dear brother.
It's
So,
Muhammad
yeah,
al-Arabi.
Muhammad, mashallah.
Yeah,
Arabi, Allah bless you. So basically, what I would say is, well, it depends what conception of panpsychism you adopt. So if you believe that, like, the fundamental building blocks or the constituents of things have a form of proto-consciousness, then that doesn't necessarily tie in line with the Islamic narrative, because from what I understand, everything has maybe a form of consciousness. Allah says in the Quran that, everything in the cosmos, praises Allah, glorifies Allah, but you just don't know how. Allah says you don't know the how. But what's interesting, when you look at that hadith concerning the tree that cried, or and other non-human objects, if you like, that seem to have some form of consciousness, it was always in reference to it having a kind of unified conscious experience. The hadith and the ayat, from what I understand, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, is that it refers to these whole things that have a unified sense of consciousness. Panpsychism, or at least a particular conception of panpsychism, may agree with that, but they specifically say that the individual constituent parts or the fundamental building blocks of the individual things, they have a form of proto-consciousness, and they may affirm a unified conscious experience. But the problem with that conception of panpsychism is, well, how do you make sense of a unified conscious experience if that thing, that whole thing that is having that conscious experience, is made up of individual parts or things or elements, if you like, that have forms of consciousness? They don't know how to basically square the circle here. So I wouldn't say the Islamic narrative adopts a panpsychism from this perspective, but yes, you may want to argue that trees are conscious, mountains are conscious, everything in the cosmos praises Allah, but Allah says you don't know how. But you can at least make the inference that when Allah mentions these things in the Quran or in the Sunnah, you see that it's referred to whole things that had a unified sense of consciousness. But rather, panpsychism says something different, especially this conception of panpsychism, that's the individual parts that have a form of proto-consciousnness. And that's why one of the detractors against panpsychism argue, well, how do you make sense of unified conscious experiences? So hopefully that clarifies my brother.
I think Hamza broke up slightly then.
Yeah, I think Hamza, we might be losing you.
Yeah, did you get the
gist
the
of what he said?
Hamza was saying?
Okay, so he's saying that basically he's talking about proto-conscious. Is that it? There is a distinction between Islamic panpsychism and consciousness in what exactly? Because I can't fathom that.
Hamza, could you explain what do you mean by collective consciousness?
Well, for example, when I'm looking at my computer screen, I'm having a unified conscious experience. I'm not basically having a conscious experience of every single pixel individually. Right. Yeah. So when I'm looking at, it's not an accumulation and amalgamation of all of these individual conscious experiences of every individual pixel. That would be a total nightmare. I wouldn't be able to have any proper meaningful experience. So when we experience things, I'm experiencing the whole, right? So likewise, when the Quran and Sunnah refer to non-human objects like trees or stones or mountains that seem to have some kind of consciousness, but even though Allah says everything in the cosmos praises Allah, but we just don't know how. So to elaborate more on that, I think wouldn't be that useful. But even if you were to make the point that there are other things that can be conscious other than humans, the point is the Quran and Sunnah refer to them as having a holistic experience, a unified conscious experience. But panpsychism, especially that particular conception of panpsychism that we're talking about, it agrees with that, but it says that the whole has individual parts or things or fundamental building blocks or elements, or whatever the case may be, that have forms of proto-consciousness. And that's why the detractors against panpsychism say, how can individual components of a whole thing have individual parts of consciousness? How can you now make a case that that thing has a unified sense of consciousness if every single thing that it contains has proto-consciousness? That's one of the kind of arguments against panpsychism. So what I would say to Brother Muhammad is, I wouldn't say that Islam agrees with panpsychism. I would more say because we wouldn't really articulate the case, or we can't make that strong inference from the Quran and Sunnah that the individual parts of the mountain or the individual parts of the tree are actually conscious as well. Yes, we can affirm the hadith that the tree cried, so it had a unified conscious experience. But can we now make the panpsychist claim that every single part of the tree had a form of consciousness? That's something that you can't infer from the hadith, and you can't infer from the Quran and the Sunnah. So my conclusion is, I would not agree with the idea that Islam agrees with panpsychism from that perspective. But
So
yes, can we
Hamza,
say that
yeah.
possible? Yeah.
I was going to say, so if I understand what you're saying, and maybe also to explain to Muhammad Moel, when I experience something, it's not every molecule in my body and every atom and every subatomic particle that is now consciously experiencing it with me. Yeah, so it's not every single part that's having this conscious experience. It's me as a whole being. Yeah. So is that what you've basically said? This is the problem with regards to this discussion about panpsychism, which is that in essence, when you experience something, or every molecule, every atom, every electron within your whole body is also experiencing it, but they're not having their own experiences. It's you having your experience of the whole.
I want to add something. What about the hadith that says the hand will testify, and so on? Your limbs will testify against you if you have used them in a wrong way. What is that supposed to mean? Wouldn't that be in line with such thinking? Or no?
Is that a question to Hamza?
Anyone. I mean, Hamza would be great because he's the guest.
Hamza. You're not interested in speaking to us, are you?
No, I spoke to that a lot, man. It's my first time speaking to Hamza. Yeah, so did he catch that?
So
go ahead.
Yeah, I did. I caught it. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I haven't looked at the specific tafsir concerning what does it mean when the hand speaks on the Day of Judgment. So I'm not going to talk about something that I haven't really analyzed or read about. I have my I have my intuitions on that. I don't think it actually means that per se. It's more of the fact that, that type of language is used in the Quran to make an emphasis that our deeds will be exposed on the Day of Judgment. What our hands did is going to come out on the Day of Judgment, and we're going to be taken into account. But I'm not going to make a categorical statement because I haven't really analyzed the ayat in question. So I allow our beloved Sharif to explain that further, inshallah.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think in a sense, Mo, it's like almost theologically insignificant. Like in the sense that whether you have, I mean, I too wouldn't know what to say about the hadith and the tafsir of the hadith, but it could either be that they're conscious or they're not. But either way, we don't really have that issue in our worldview because there's no problem with anything at all being conscious. So I just don't think it's very important. I mean, once you do have this dualistic understanding of the world, and once you have this overarching worldview that can account for this subjective first-person experience, the finer details of that aren't very significant, I think, philosophically or theologically, in my point of view, really.
Okay. So yeah, that's it. Thanks. Assalamu
alaikum. All right, we've got Momo here. He's been waiting a while.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
I had a quick question for Brother Hamza. It's actually regarding the same topic of panpsychism. So basically, there's like many narrations regarding how the hill talks to the Prophet and how stones also talk to the Prophet and stuff like that.
Yes.
And yeah, as the previous brother mentioned, like the hand and like testifying. So, and there's also like other narrations regarding how the sun and moon prostrate to Allah. So doesn't that kind of like signify like some sort of hands, like I don't know, like some oneness of consciousness or something? Like,
well, yeah, I'm just going to repeat the same thing I said. The particular conception of panpsychism we're talking about is that individual parts of the whole are also conscious. But when you look at the hadith concerning the hand or the stone or the sun or whatever you want to call it, even if you don't take a metaphorical view on this, right? Which I would disagree with, because the majority of the ulama took a metaphorical view, for example, concerning these type of things, right? The point here is that it's talking about a unified conscious experience. And that's the problem of panpsychism. We have to understand that panpsychism doesn't just say that. It says that, say that this hand is conscious, right? And it has a unified conscious experience. They're going to testify against me. What panpsychism is saying is every single atom, it has a form of consciousness. So when they articulate that, we would say, well, how can you now make sense of a unified conscious experience, this hand having a unified conscious experience, if every single atom has a form of consciousness? How can you make sense of that? How do you kind of, make sense of a unified conscious experience if you affirm that every single part of that thing also has forms of consciousness? That's one of the problems of panpsychism. So what I would say is, you can't say that Islam adopts panpsychism from that perspective, because all you can say is that if the hand is going to speak, or the stone is going to speak, or the sun's going to prostrate, whatever the case may be, these are referring to whole things, like the whole hand and the whole sun and the whole stone and the whole tree, that actually has a unified conscious experience, if you even want to call it that, right? And if you even want to move away from a metaphorical understanding, even if you adopt that view, you can't say it's a panpsychist view, because the conception of panpsychism that we're talking about is that each individual element, in each individual part, each individual fundamental building blocks, wherever you think the fundamental building blocks are, have a forms of proto-consciousness. And that's one of the conceptual problems of panpsychism, is because, well, you say, well, how does that now make sense of a unified conscious experience? That's the point.
okay, Jazakallah for that. And just one more small question: how does the the aql, like the intellect, relate to the soul? So is the aql connected to the physical brain, or is it connected to the soul, or the heart, the spiritual heart?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna look. These questions are debated in our classical tradition. So the aql, the intellect, according to many of the ulama, is a function of the qalb. What is the nature of the qalb? I'm not even going to go into that. I'm not going to unpack that, because that is a massive scholarly debate. I have my own particular position on this, but I think it won't be right to articulate that. The point is, not knowing this doesn't affect today's topic, right? Not knowing about what is the dynamic interplay between the aql and the qalb and the ruh and the fitra and the nafs, all of these things. What is the dynamic interplay here? Well, there's lots of discussion amongst our beloved ulama in the classical tradition, and I ask you to explore that. But even if you take any of those positions, it doesn't undermine what we're saying today, which is there is a hard problem of consciousness based on two key questions. What is it like for an individual conscious organism to have a phenomenal conscious experience, an inner conscious experience? And number two, how and why does a inner subjective conscious experience arise from seemingly non-conscious blind physical processes? Materialism can't answer those questions, and that's the main issue. So your question is a nice question, but I have to stay in my lane. I'm not going to answer it, although I have my intuitions on the topic. But if anyone else has a complete answer on something which I think is not even conclusive amongst many ulama about the dynamic interplay between these things, Bismillah.
Yeah, no. I mean, I totally agree with you, Hamza. There's difference of opinion within the tradition. I don't think it's really a hill to die on, so to speak.
Yeah.
So But Momo, we appreciate you coming on and appreciate your question.
Okay, Jazakallah for that.
So,
Allah bless you guys.
Momo, before you just leave, did you understand Hamza's response though, in terms of the fact that what the Quran and the Sunnah talk about on the matters of the ruh, or the qalb, does not affect the discussion about consciousness and the fact that it cannot be explained under a materialistic paradigm.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah,
understand?
I get that.
Okay, cool.
Okay, Jazakallah for that. And just one more thing, can either like one of you guys make a vid on like creed, like either brother Hamza or maybe Jake, like regarding creed and just like maybe a broad overview of like the 3 creeds.
I mean, it may interest you. On my own channel, Muslim Metaphysician, I just did a video on divine simplicity and its position in the Islamic tradition. So, broadly speaking, in all 3 schools, the Ash'ari, Maturidis, and Atheist, we all reject absolute divine simplicity in the sense we believe that God has real, distinct attributes that are not identical to each other. But going into much more detail about the, fine details and the distinctions between the creeds, I don't know. If I'm honest, I don't think that that's going to be the place to really do it on this podcast. But maybe I'll touch on it a bit more in my on my personal YouTube channel.
Okay. Jazakallah for that. Assalamu alaikum.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. So we've got Adam here, and Adam, you're going to be the last guest because typically we go for about 2 hours. We've actually gone over the 2-hour mark, and Brother Hamza's been gracious enough to stay with us this whole time. We don't want to take up too much more of his time. Unfortunately, we were looking to get some more atheists on. I don't know. Maybe they're watching, but they didn't want to come on.
This will be a fruitful discussion nonetheless. Don't worry.
Yeah. So Adam, you're going to be the last guest. You've been on before on other shows, so I'm glad that you came on with your correct name this time.
Yeah, no worries. So, I just have a personal belief that even though I am a Muslim, I do think that that everything in the universe is conscious. So I don't know if I'm not necessarily a pantheist. I don't believe everything is God, but I do think that everything in the universe is conscious because I'm also a determinist. But I'm a compatible. I don't know how to pronounce it. Sorry,
Sorry, you said what's
the relationship between determinism and consciousness? It usually goes the other way around, brother. If I'm going to be honest with you.
So the relationship is that because due to the contingency argument, if everything is independent, then then that's where I extrapolate and say that everything's necessary and conscious.
Who said everything is independent?
According to the contingency argument.
Everything? No, there is something that is independent, but not everything.
No, can I? Yeah, I'm saying everything is independent because according to determinism, everything must be the way it is according to determinism.
Yeah, but brother, you're confusing me. Like maybe you're making a good argument, but I just don't understand it right now. So you're talking about the contingency argument. Forget about determinism for a bit.
They're deeply related.
Okay, they might be related, but you're gonna have to bridge that gap for me. Maybe I'm slow. So the contingency argument, right? How does it say that everything is independent? It says that there is something that is independent.
The premise is that anything which could not be any other way is independent and necessary. And since I believe that everything in the universe
could not be any other way, okay.
Yeah, and so I believe everything in the universe is independent because I'm a determinist. It couldn't have been any other way. Therefore,
but you're okay. Sorry to cut you off, but you're not talking about metaphysical necessity here or independence. So when you talk about a lot of people confuse this sometimes. So determinism, when you talk about determinism and how a certain chain of causation is necessary, we're not speaking of metaphysical necessity. We're just speaking of
Yeah,
like a logical or causal necessity. So I think there might be a bit of an equivocation between the necessity of like the necessary entity that the contingency argument takes us to, and the necessary relation between a cause and its effect. Those are two very different things.
And Adam, how does this
actually
relate to the
disagree.
discussion of consciousness? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that is a more important question.
Well, no, it leads to, because after this, I extrapolate to say that since everything is necessary, then it's conscious in that it must. It's basically like an independent being, the everything, but I don't consider it God because I still believe in a God.
Yeah, but did you know? Because I understand that that's where you're going
gonna
with this.
respond-
But
yeah.
Did you understand that you're equivocating between a metaphysical necessity and this like cause effect necessity?
Yeah. So the contingency argument, even when I'm not, when you hear it, like it's just by it doesn't only deal with because people will say, okay, they'll use examples of things which exist in the physical world, the universe. So they'll say, okay, the sun must be dependent because it could have been it could have been another way. So it doesn't necessarily lead to a metaphysical conclusion. It deals, because what I'm saying is everything in the universe must be independent. So that's not necessarily metaphysical.
But the idea is that the contingent world is metaphysically contingent, but you're trying to say that because of determinism somehow and the necessary flow between cause and effect, that somehow that necessity is a different kind of necessity. You're trying to say that that necessity implies some metaphysical kind of necessity.
Could you clarify what do you mean by in the metaphysical world, the contingency?
Yeah, so if I drop my phone, it's gonna fall. Maybe you could call that some kind of an empirical necessity.
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
not
a metaphysical necessity. Yes. So what you're trying to say is because of determinism and this chain of cause and effect, because you're a determinist, you have to believe that everything is necessary. I don't think that follows, not in the metaphysical sense, or the how we use it in modal epistemology, necessary, not in that sense.
Your example with the phone being dropped, that's a physical that's a cause and effect relationship in the physical world. It's not metaphysical.
Yeah, that's my point.
No, so
maybe I'm lost. Maybe someone else understands what Adam is saying. I'm just lost because I think you're trying to say that the contingent world is necessary somehow because of this cause-effect relationships and this determinacy. But what I'm trying to tell you is that even if you're a determinist, even if the world is truly deterministic, that doesn't make it metaphysically necessary. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Do you understand that point?
Yeah, I understand. You're using metaphysical, even though I don't think that what you're saying is metaphysical.
No, so metaphysical necessity is something that couldn't have been otherwise. So let's talk about determinism. There's a certain chain of causation. Cause leads to effect, right? That's a causal necessity that could have been otherwise. It could have been that instead of X leading to Y, X could have led to someone else. Something else. Y could have led to X. There's a metaphysical possibility that it could have been otherwise. You don't agree?
No, so that's the whole idea of determinism, is that there are no multiple options. There's no probability.
That's not determinism. You're talking about physical determinism?
X must lead to Y. There's no other possibility.
It's not a metaphysical necessity. It's because of the causal chain between X and Y that X must lead to Y.
It didn't have to be that way.
It doesn't mean that there couldn't be a possible world where Y could lead to X, or there could be some different kind of causal foundation. It's just so I think you're conflating two things here.
Why could there be? Could you you're assuming that, right?
Yeah, but right now I have to explain. I'm not assuming it.
So that you can continue, right? You're assuming there's no. That's in determinism. This world could not have been any other way. Everything 14 billion years ago, or ever since the Big Bang, whatever has happened must have happened. That's the whole idea of determinism. There's no.
So I don't think we're gonna have the time to go. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna have the time to break this down to you. But I think you just misunderstand what it means to be a determinist, because some determinists, they acknowledge that although this chain of cause and effect, this chain of causation is necessary in the sense that no effect is independent of the causal chain that precedes it, they don't mean by that, they don't elevate that to some kind of they don't make that modal shift, right, to make it metaphysically necessary, in the sense that it isn't even conceivable, it couldn't be otherwise, that this cause would lead to this effect. Those are two entirely different things.
And Adam, how does this relate to the consciousness?
Well, it doesn't.
Yeah,
This is the other point, Adam, is that what you're describing, determinism, they would say it's contingently necessary.
Who's they?
Meaning,
I'm a determinist.
Adam, let me finish, please. So what it means is that given the current state of affairs and given the Big Bang and everything that you explained, yes, it's contingently necessary now that we are in the place that we are. But it is not metaphysically necessary in the sense that it couldn't have been otherwise in other possible worlds and existences. So these are two different things that I don't think you understand or appreciate.
No, I do. And I know where our contention is. Our contention is that the first cause could not have been any other way. I say that, and you disagree.
What do you mean? You think it couldn't have been any other way?
Yeah, I say the first cause could...
What was the first cause? Was the first cause God?
Yes, and everything which followed, he had to...
So God didn't have a free will. He couldn't have been otherwise, meaning he couldn't have chosen not to create. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he had. Okay, he had to create.
So this is the problem. This is not
from my worldview. From my worldview,
right? And this is the issue. I explained it on the stream on my channel yesterday when I talked about divine simplicity. Is that divine simplicity results in what you're explaining? That God doesn't have free will. Everything becomes necessary, and there's this modal collapse. If you want to take that position, be my guest, you can, but it is not. Let me finish. But it is not the traditional Islamic position, and it's considered heretical. So to claim that God doesn't have free will when the Quran and the Sunnah actually clearly state that he does have free will is problematic.
Okay, so you're posing questions to me. So let me actually...
Well, I didn't ask a question. I made statement.
No, you said from... Okay, so let me explain my belief, because so we've gotten to this point so far. I think that the first cause, which God... I don't think it's God. I think... So the first cause is not God. I'm talking about the first physical cause that God created, which led to all of the other causes, the physical causes in the universe, which led up to this point. I think that could not have been any other way. And it was God's free will who chose that before he created it. But you're talking about
Did he have a choice to create it or not?
You're talking about a dilemma. You're talking about the determinism and free will dilemma.
I'm saying with respect to God, did he have a choice to create this world or not?
The first thing.
Yes, I think metaphysical beings have free will. Yes.
Okay. So Adam, just going back to what Abdulrahman said.
I actually have sorry.
Abdulrahman said you're conflating metaphysical determinism with causal determinism, and this is exactly what he meant, which is you can talk about something being contingently caused in a chain of events where X causes Y, Y causes Z, and so on. Yeah. But what this doesn't necessitate is that X would cause Y. It could be the case that the system that's set up could be that X causes Z and Z causes Y, and then that becomes contingently deterministic. Do you understand the difference between the two?
So God actually had to create us. In the Quran, it says that
Adam, I'm not talking about the Quran. I'm talking about what is when Abdulrahman was talking before.
Adam, you just said that God has free will. Let's not go back there. You just said that God could have chosen not to create. Okay, but Adam, I think the problem here, we're going too off track from the topic. In order for you to show us what you're trying to say about everything being conscious, you have to take us through these, huge considerations that we're not going to agree on. We're going to have to go through the foundations.
Even the Quran says everything's conscious.
What do you mean? My Quran?
It's mine as well.
That doesn't sound like a Muslim.
agree.
It doesn't sound like a Muslim. But
No,
anyway, we're not
that's
talking
your
about the
opinion.
Quran.
I don't,
We're not
I
talking.
don't
We're
really
not
care if you think
okay.
I'm a Muslim or not. Okay, that's
No,
no.
Adam,
I'm just saying
we
that
will
doesn't
accept
sound.
we will accept that you are Muslim. Yeah, so don't worry. We're not going to say that.
Yeah,
but it
I'm
is a
not
bit
saying you're
odd
not.
to say.
I'm not saying you're not a Muslim, Adam. I'm just saying that doesn't sound like a very Muslim thing to say. So I'm not saying you're not a Muslim. But anyway, the point is that the topic of this stream is unrelated to the Quran. And right now, if we're gonna have to go through contingency arguments, and if we're gonna have to go through contingency arguments and determinism, and take into consideration your metaphysical commitments versus our metaphysical commitments, and walk you through epistemology and modal logic in order to for you to drive us to your
you're throwing out these terms as if I mean, yeah.
No, to be honest,
logic,
they're very well known terms that you should know if you're trying to make this kind of an argument. I mean, this is not. I'm not trying to make up any big terms or anything.
Instead of just throwing out these terms.
If you're talking about Adam, if you're talking about necessity and contingency, and you're making these bold claims about everything having consciousness on that basis, I take it that you should, one second, you should know what modal logic is. I mean, I think, but anyway, that's not the point. The point is that right now we're going to have to go through so much baggage in order for you to take us to this conclusion. So is there another route where we can, through which we can address the topic of this stream from your perspective without going through all that?
Yeah. Okay, fine.
So Adam, how do you explain consciousness? Do you think it's a hard problem?
I'll use Islamic responses instead of the metaphysical arguments. We can get into that some other stream if you guys want to. Okay, but just based off the Quran, you should believe based off the Quran that everything is conscious. The Kaaba is conscious according. I don't have the verse.
Adam, you're misunderstanding the question. The question isn't is everything conscious.
No, you're interrupting.
We didn't ask that question. I asked the question: is there a hard problem of consciousness? That's the question I asked.
Is there a hard problem of consciousness?
Yeah, is there a hard problem trying to predicate consciousness within a materialistic worldview?
Yeah, Adam, do you know what the hard problem of consciousness is?
Yeah, it is. It's trying to explain consciousness on physicalism, and I think that consciousness arises in a metaphysical it's a metaphysical reality.
Then we're in agreement then. So
yeah.
Oh,
so
I thought we were discussing whether everything's conscious or not.
No, that's just one
not
view.
The discussion.
There is a certain view in philosophy of mind, and some philosophers come up with these theories that are about panpsychism, that everything is conscious or everything has some kind of a proto-consciousness to it. That's one theory, but then it's not necessarily mutually exclusive with a theistic worldview. We're not saying that Islam is explicitly committed to this. Maybe some Muslims might think otherwise, but I think that's besides the point. The point is there a hard problem of consciousness on materialism, and can they deal with it? We think they can't. You kind of seem to be agreeing with us, so I don't think there's a problem unless you just want to talk about panpsychism from an Islamic perspective, but I think we've already touched upon that.
Oh yeah, I heard you. That's why I heard you guys talking to the guest about the. I might have misunderstood.
So Adam, do you understand why even atheist philosophers agree with panpsychism? Why they approach it that way?
Why some atheist philosophers are panpsychists? I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there are different reasons for holding the belief. Probably to get around to not believe in God. That's one. To explain complexity without believing in a separate conscious being.
Well, one of the key reasons why they propose panpsychism is because they say that because there's an in-principle problem trying to bridge the gap between materialism and consciousness, they will take consciousness as a brute fact, something we just have to accept, and that as a result, we will accept it in all material objects.
Yeah, that's not scientific at all.
Well, that's what panpsychism is. That's what they believe.
Adam, unfortunately, we've been going on here for about 2.5 hours. We're going to have to cut you short. Maybe we will have a future stream on determinism and sort of related to the question that you're asked. And you can join in at that point, and we can have a discussion about that then. But
Yeah, no problem.
we're gonna have to end the stream now, unfortunately.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
All right.
Welcome.
Thanks, Adam. Jazakallah khair.
Jake, you might want to mention that Hamza unfortunately had to go.
Yeah. Hamza, unfortunately, he was having a little bit of connection issues early on, which I think people were able to see. But then he unfortunately had to go. So we do appreciate Brother Hamza coming on. He was, like I said, gracious enough to stay for over 2 hours, mashallah, and really enjoyed and appreciate him coming on. I don't know if you guys have any final thoughts on the discussion that we've been having today before we wrap it up.
No, I think we've pretty much spoken about this topic and addressed a lot of the issues. I think there's a lot more, even more, that we can probably discuss on this topic, and there's a lot more discussions to break down. I think the issue is that what people try to do when they talk about consciousness is they try to say, oh, it's the brain, yeah. Oh, we just don't have enough information yet. We can answer it once we get more science. Or, they will try to say, oh, it can be worked out if we know which neuron causes what type of sensation or feeling in the brain or experience. So they give these various explanations. And I think what you find is that every time they give an explanation, so the issue of the science, well, it's not the fact that we don't know enough of the science. It's the fact that it's an in-principle problem that science cannot address. So that's the first thing. Just simply saying, well, it's the brain does not actually then explain to us how these experiences come about. And neither does just simply identify neurons and which neurons produces what type of, conscious awareness. So none of these things can really explain it. And I think Hamza, really wanted to talk about elimination. Is it elimination theory? Where basically they deny consciousness.
Eliminative materialism.
Eliminative materialism. So where they just deny consciousness, and some atheists, some philosophers of science physicalists end up going down the route to say, well, there is no consciousness as a result, which seems ridiculous.
Yeah, which, I mean, Rosenberg in the book I was reading earlier, that's what he literally says, because that's eventually what it leads to. But I do want to just make one last comment on identity theory, because fortunately we didn't get too many atheists on. The two main theories that I hear when I speak to atheists are identity theory and emergentism. Brother Hamza touched on emergentism a little bit, but identity theory basically says that the brain states and the mental states are identical to one another, so that there's no difference between the two. I just want to point out that the issue with this is within the name of the theory itself, identity. So we talked about identity in the past with things like the Trinity, and the issue is that as per Leibniz's law in classical identity, that if two things are identical, that whatever's true of one also has to be true of the other, and vice versa. And unfortunately, when it comes to the brain states and the mental states, there are things that I can say that are true of my mental states that are not true of my brain states. For example, I can have an experience of color. For example, I can see this red hat, but everyone knows, no one is obviously going to make the claim that my brain state, which is supposedly identical to that, is actually colorful and is actually red or whatever. Same way, likewise, I can make comments about, for example, typically mental states are understood as not spatio-temporal. So they're not located in space, whereas a brain state obviously is. So the issue with identity theory is that it says that the brain states and the mental states are identical to one another. But the problem is that we can say things that are true of one that are not true of the other. I did just want to touch on that very briefly before we ended it, because of the fact that we didn't get any atheists on to really mention that. And I didn't want that to pass us by. But Abdul, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add before we end the stream.
Just very quickly, I don't think we've touched enough on the argument from reason, so I just think we should have a different stream for that, because it's a very, very important one, and I think it's a very important discussion. It's about grounding rationality on naturalism. I think we mentioned it, but we haven't really gone through much of the details. But I think this is a more direct route to God, as in this is an argument it's both against naturalism and in favor of theism. I think consciousness can be the argument from consciousness can be formulated in that way too. Probably not as straightforwardly as the argument from reason, but yeah, I think we should probably do a different stream on that, and also on determinism. But yeah, I think that's it for me.
Yep, inshallah. Yeah, so maybe next time we will do a stream building on this discussion, in which we will talk about arguments from reason and things like that, because it is related to consciousness, kind of offshoot from that. But once again, I appreciate Brother Hamza for coming on. I appreciate everybody watching. Do consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing on it on your social media, especially, no matter how big or small your platforms are. We really do appreciate it. And once again, guys, thanks for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi.